Welcome everyone to the annual ETHU seminar this year, titled Objects, Technology, Existence, Engaging with Graham Harman's OOO. I'm very glad to be welcoming you all, and thank you for joining us, of course. I'll give a little bit more practical instruction right away, but first of all, I want to give the floor for a couple of introductory words to the director of our research group, and that is Professor Karl Verstrenge. So please, Karl, the floor is yours.
Well, also from my side, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you find yourself on this globe that we all somehow share, right? So from the Walloon provinces, that's where I find myself, which is the French-speaking part of Belgium. I wish you a warm welcome to, indeed, as Joni said, our annual research seminar, which is this year fully dedicated to object-oriented ontology. I wish you a warm welcome, especially also our speakers, our distinguished keynote speaker, Graham Harman, who is about to give his lecture in a moment. So maybe some words very briefly on the research seminar. The Center for Ethics and Humanism is a research center which is linked to the Department of Philosophy of the University of Brussels. And mainly we're doing research along three big axes, which are subjectivity, intersubjectivity, existence, contemporary ethical debates and issues, whatever they may be. Also strongly there present the philosophy of technology, and then research on humanism and enlightenment. So our annual ETHU seminar is, well, as the word says itself, I guess, organized once a year. And so this year, my colleague and I, Professor van den Ede, and I have the pleasure to introduce, well, a quite famous topic. Well, it starts growing and growing on object-oriented ontology. I wish you all a nice evening or morning, again, wherever you find yourself on this globe. You can find the program on our website. You find also all kind of information about the speakers, about, well, a shortcut for what they're going to say. So I hope you enjoy yourselves. That's what I will try to do in any case. And I give back the floor to Joni, who I guess will say some more information and then give the floor to our keynote speaker. Joni?
Yes, thank you, Karl. Well, I'm not going to say a lot about the topic of this symposium. Of course, you have read the short description on our website, and you can still read it. And I guess you have, it's with that expectation that you have come to this gathering. But of course, the topic is, like Karl already said, object-oriented ontology, and in particular, of course, Graham Harman's work and philosophy. In particular, we also have a specific focus, and which is in line with an important research track and research program that we're developing at the Center for Ethics and Humanism, and which is about philosophy of technology, as Karl also already mentioned. And specifically, we want to try and apply the insights from OOO, or try to research, in any case, the potential application of OOO to matters of technology and of living with technology. Hence, of course, the not unimportant term of existence also in the title. Now, that's what I'll say about the topic, because while long introductions are already tiresome enough in physical settings, I think they are certainly tedious in online interactions. So I propose we start as soon as possible, but not before I elucidate some house rules, and it's a kind request to all of you, all of the participants. Once again, I'll have to ask you, please switch off your camera and mute your microphone during the whole event. It's not that we want to shut you up. We'd like to hear your thoughts, but please interact with us and with the speakers through the chat function. That keeps things as organized as possible, because a lot of times these online events well, technical problems happen, and to evade that as much as possible, please interact through the chat, but please, so as not to distract the speakers while they're doing their presentation or giving their lecture, save your questions if you can until the Q&A session. So we every time after a lecture, we have a Q&A session. So if you have a question, please save them up until then and type them in the chat box. One of us will moderate, and we'll do our best to tackle as many questions as possible. Please also don't be disappointed if your question happens to fall along the wayside. It depends a little bit on how many questions there will be, but we'll do our best. And of course, the speakers are also free and very much welcomed to monitor the chat and read the questions there and go into questions and remarks as they see fit. Okay, two last announcements before we begin. First of all, here's a short look at the program at a glance. You can find the program also on the website. This is how the evening will look. And then the second announcement is actually a little bit promotion for an other event, not organized by me or by us, but an external announcement for those of you who after tonight can get enough of OOO and our speakers. There will be a symposium at the end of April organized by Arjen Klein-Herenbrink, who is one of the speakers here of Radboud University. And you can find all information here. I'll post the link into the chat box right away. So, of course, if you're interested, please, you can definitely join that symposium on April 28th. Right. With that said, without further ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker. And once again, in order to keep things as short as possible in an online event, I think that's always appropriate. I'll also keep the introductions very, very short. So let me suffice in saying that I personally think that Graham Harman, Professor Harman, is one of the most important philosophers alive. And I'm not saying that as a sort of lip service. I really mean that. And I have learned so much in the past 10 years already from his work. So it's for me a great pleasure and a great honor to now give the floor to our keynote speaker, Professor Harman.
Thank you for that. Only it was 10 years ago in Brussels that we met for the first time, and haven't seen each other since then, but we've kept up via email correspondence, and now thank you for organizing this event. The topic of my talk today, which is supposed to go for 55 minutes, more or less, is the current state of object-oriented ontology, which is usually abbreviated with 3 O's. I pronounce it OOO. You can say OOO also, but it's a little harder. It doesn't roll off the tongue as well. And just a quick bit of background about this term. As some of you already know, object-oriented philosophy was the term I used somewhat jokingly back in the late 90s, stealing the term from computer science, object-oriented programming, and then it kind of stuck. I used it at a conference and it stuck, people liked it. And then Levi Bryant later introduced the variant object-oriented ontology, since there were multiple people working within that research program. And so I can't speak for everybody else today. I can't speak for Levi or Tim Morton or Ian Bogost or others, some of whom are here today. I'm only speaking for myself. So I want to start with an email I received yesterday from a friend in Hungary, part of which goes like this. He said, interestingly, here in Hungary, the art world has been most enthusiastic about OOO, the philosophy community being, for some reason, generally a bit less open-minded. And my response to this was, that's not just Hungary. That's the way it's going everywhere. That's OOO is thriving mostly in departments that are not philosophy departments. I'm in an architecture school now and have been for 5 years. I wouldn't be surprised if I spend the rest of my career either here or in some other architecture school or art program or some other more general humanities thing, and not in a philosophy department. Now, what does that tell us? And there are 3 possible general kinds of answers to that as I can see it. The first and the harshest would be, that's because OOO sucks, right? Real philosophers see through it. It's just a fad, and OOO is out there deceiving artists and architects who don't have the philosophy background to see what a sham it all is. And this is the kind of explanation, of course, you'll get in Pete Wolfendale's book or from Brian Leiter on his blog, or anyone who's hostile to OOO will tell you something like that. And it might be satisfying for those people to say it, but it's not really true, of course. OOO is grounded in philosophical texts. It's pretty classically grounded in the tradition. As I'm going to say later, it's coming out of what Aristotle was doing. You can't really make the claim that OOO is not a philosophy. Arguments are given. You can't make the claim that OOO doesn't give arguments, even though Wolfendale tries to make that claim in his book sometimes. No, there are plenty of arguments. They're not the ones that we're used to hearing in philosophy departments. So that's the first kind of answer you could give. The second kind of answer would be something like a disciplinary generalization, that philosophy departments always move slowly compared to fields like architecture that have to be nimble and have to be adjusting to whatever is contemporary at any given moment in the field, like computer science or some others that are very up to date and have to be up to the minute. Philosophy moves slowly. Philosophy is a field in which, in some sense, Immanuel Kant is still a contemporary. And Martin Heidegger is, in some sense, almost still among the living, because maybe not that much of fundamental importance would happen in a 100-year period in philosophy as compared to a 100-year period in architecture or some other field. It's possible. That's one way of looking at it. The explanation I prefer, however, is the third one, which is that there are two kinds of philosophy that rule today. And I'm not talking about analytic and continental. I'm talking about one that's a kind of transcendental standpoint, where you have to start with what's given to humans, and then somehow there's this kind of puzzle as to how you get out of that and establish a relation between human thoughts and the world. Or you get a kind of naturalistic, or at worst, scientistic standpoint in which nature governs everything and explains everything. And humans are just one more example of a natural object that can be approached by means of tools used by the natural sciences. And if that third explanation is the right one, as I think it is, then there is a real structural problem for OOO with respect to contemporary philosophy, because OOO is neither a transcendentalism nor a naturalism. Okay, so what's the current state of OOO? That's what I wanted to talk about. Well, in one sense, there's a conference being held here, very nicely organized by Yoni and others, and it's not the first one. So OOO has had some success, even if a lot of that success has been in disciplines outside philosophy departments, and I mean virtually every discipline. I can't begin to even keep track of all the different fields I've heard from. There was my book on Dante. We had a conference at a business school about the relevance of that book to business, organizational theory. So these kinds of things keep happening. So obviously people are finding some use for this or some possible application for this in whatever it is they're doing. And OOO isn't unique in that respect. My forerunner in this sense, someone I know personally, Bruno Latour, actor network theory is another philosophical method that was picked up in fields outside of philosophy, primarily in anthropology and the social sciences. As recently as a few years ago, I had to explain to philosophy professors who Bruno Latour was. They'd never heard of him. That's not maybe true in Belgium and the Netherlands, but it's still true sometimes in the United States. And if they've heard of him as some kind of crazy social constructionist. And in fact, we brought Bruno Latour to Cairo in 2003 as our distinguished visiting professor. And at the time, he said that was only the second time he had ever been invited to a philosophy department, the first having been UC San Diego, where the Churchlands were. And so this is not a rare predicament. OOO's predicament is similar to actor network theory, though of course actor network theory has been around longer and is far more widespread. It's a monster method. It's everywhere. But OOO has a bit of that in it. This is also an opportune moment for me to reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of OOO. My first publication was relatively late compared to some people. It was my first book, Tool Being, 2002. I was 34 years old. I'm now 52 years old, so it's 18 years that have passed. In another 18 years, I'll be 70. And even though 70 is in some sense the new 50, I'll probably have done my best work by 70. So I'm halfway through the book of my career in some sense. So this is a good moment to look at what we've accomplished in OOO and what we've maybe failed to accomplish so far. So one thing that happens to everyone in intellectual life is that we all have bad days. We all have days where we feel like throwing in the towel and saying, why did I spend my life on this? What am I doing? Is this really going anywhere? Or am I spinning my wheels? What do you do when you have a day like that? Well, the most effective thing to do, I think, is to go back to the basics and ask yourself, what is it in your research program that is unshakable for you and that keeps pushing you in the direction you're going and convinces you that you have not wasted your life? Well, a couple of things in my case. The first of them is going to be what Nikki Young talks about next, ontotaxonomy. And I sometimes call this taxonomy. Nikki convinced me that ontotaxonomy works well as a term and captures the interest of those who hear it. By ontotaxonomy, I mean the idea, which has dominated much of philosophy really since Kant, which is the idea that there are basically two kinds of things in the universe: human thought and everything else. Now, at a surface level, this is, of course, absurd. We know that humans are a fairly minor species in a vast universe. Even on this planet, there's a myriad of life forms with their own skills. There's no particular surface reason to say, oh, humans are so special just because we're humans that we deserve half of ontology and everything else goes in the other basket, everything else in the universe. Well, of course, there's a reason people do this. People are not stupid for doing this. Of course, the reason is the idea that we have some kind of immediate access to human thought in a way that we don't have access to everything else. So Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Kant's notion that we have access only to the phenomenal, not to the noumenal, and so forth. The general discredit into which the thing in itself has always fallen. Isn't it funny? Immanuel Kant, the most influential philosopher of the modern period, everyone has been influenced by Kant in one way or another, or in many ways still in his shadow, and yet his very central topic, the thing in itself, the Ding an sich, is accepted by almost nobody. Immediately, the first maneuver when you respond to Kant is to find some way to amputate that from his philosophy and call it a residue of dogmatism, but Kant's philosophy cannot work. His critique of dogmatism cannot work without the thing in itself. That's why dogmatism is critiqued. And so OOO is one of those rare schools of philosophy that accepts the thing in itself and insists on wrestling with it, and also says that it's not true that you can't say anything about it. It's not true that nothing can be said about the thing in itself. There may have to be different ways of talking about it. There's not, in other words, it's not just that you can speak clearly about something or you can't speak about it at all, as in Wittgenstein's Tractatus. The things of which you cannot speak clearly are the things of which philosophy must speak. Philosophy is not a form of knowledge. I'll get into that a little bit later. Philosophy is it's a cognitive discipline that is not a form of knowledge and is not coextensive with the natural sciences for that reason, in my view. Okay, so anyway, back to ontotaxonomy. OOO opposes ontotaxonomy, opposes the idea that you start with the thought world relation and then move on to the other relations. And in practice, how this usually plays out in modern philosophy is as a division of labor. So yes, we can talk about object-object relation, but let's let the sciences do that because they're doing it so brilliantly. Look at how much success the natural sciences are having. They're a model for rigorous cognition. And then philosophy kind of gets the soft stuff that's left over, like human viewpoints. How do human viewpoints influence the way we see object-object interactions and other things of that sort? Philosophy is left with the human world, the thought world relation or the human world relation, whereas the world-world relation, object-object relations, are left to the sciences as their monopoly. And I think this division of labor is untenable. For one thing, because both sides cheat, right? You get philosophers who try to cheat by turning nature into something socially constructed so that philosophy and the human sciences can lord it over nature by saying, well, it's all the standards for good science are set by society, therefore the human realm is in charge of everything anyway. That's a kind of cheating, but it's also a kind of cheating to say, yeah, but humans are just made of protons, neutrons, and electrons like everything else, and therefore we can be adequately studied with the methods of natural science. So the division of labor does not work. And in its extreme form, you get Metzinger's discussion with Wolf Singer in his book, The Ego Tunnel, where Wolf Singer kind of reassuringly pats philosophers on the head and says, but don't worry, philosophers, we'll still need you for ethics panels, even though neurology is going to take over all the former philosophical problems. You'll still be needed for ethical decisions. Okay, not to speak badly of ethics panels. I mean, I was in charge of the IRB in Egypt when I was there, and it's very important work, but philosophy has a lot more to do than to make ethical decisions about thorny, nasty, messy ethical problems involving science. Okay, so here, this is one of the strengths of OOO, the fact that we reject ontotaxonomy from the start, reject the idea that everything's either human thought or something else, and that those are the two kinds of categories that exist. Because if you take that standpoint, you are in a minority, you're in a big intellectual minority even now, I meant to say a tiny intellectual minority, and you're guaranteed a certain amount of freshness for that reason. You're also guaranteed a certain amount of hostility and dismissiveness, as we have all found. Also, the idea of a theory of objects. And the reason I use object instead of thing, some people, that question comes up repeatedly. Why do I talk about objects? Why don't I talk about things instead, or units like E.M. Bogost? It's simply to express my historical debt to the Austrian school of object theory, coming out of Brentano's school. And so, of course, Husserl was a big influence on OOO. And there's also Meinong, of course, who has a very developed theory of objects. But as Tristan Garcia has pointed out in an important lecture that's no longer posted online, unfortunately, this Austrian school talks about the relation of human thought to objects. It doesn't really get into object-object relations the way we want to. And of course, there's the Heideggerian element in OOO, which is still somewhat strong and was there at its origin, which is the idea you can't have direct access to the objects, which you also find in Kant. But what you don't find in Heidegger is a discussion of the object-object relationship, right? Or even in Husserl, the idea that objects relate to each other just as they relate to human thought, and that we need a general theory that can talk about all of those cases. Whitehead does that, right? And Whitehead's an interesting case. If I were to ask you who is the most important philosopher who is somewhat disowned by both the analytic and continental traditions, I think the answer to that is Whitehead. When Whitehead is mentioned in an analytic context, it's usually in connection with his work with Russell, the Principia Mathematica. When Whitehead is mentioned in continental contexts, it's in one of two ways. Either it's through Deleuze, and all praise to Deleuze's open-mindedness for reawakening an appreciation for Whitehead. I don't think the Deleuzean Whitehead is the correct Whitehead, personally. We can maybe talk about that later if someone wants to. Also in Latourian circles, right? Isabel Stenger is right there in Brussels, did so much to awaken an appreciation of the importance of Whitehead in the French-speaking philosophical world. And of course, through her influence, Latour became interested in Whitehead. It was through his friendship with Isabel Stenger. So we owe a lot to her for that. Her Whitehead is still a little too Deleuzian for me too, but again, that's another issue. The problem with Whitehead for OOO is that his philosophy is too relational. So I've written about that a lot. So I don't think I need to go into it too much here. The idea that for Whitehead, the most concrete analysis of a thing is to analyze it into its prehensions, which means to analyze it into its relations. Whereas OOO wants to take into account the non-relational core of things. Not that things don't engage in relations, but that relations are relatively rare, that most things do not relate to most of the things in their environments. OOO is not saying that nothing relates to anything else, but that nothing relates to everything else. That's one way to put it. That relations take work and can't simply be assumed as a natural feature ontologically of the cosmos. Okay, so that's one of the things that keeps me confident in the basic trajectory of OOO, even if I'm having a bad day. That I can't accept any ontotaxonomical standpoint in which the human thought is the starting point. And so that goes for phenomenology, it goes for Heidegger, it goes for a lot of Kant, a lot of philosophical perspectives that are very worthy, but that I simply can't accept that part of them. Here's the other thing, not the other thing, another thing that keeps me confident about OOO even on bad days. It's a fairly classical research program. As much as our enemies want to say it's a fad, that it's a brand, all these other things that are just, these are rhetorical maneuvers often used out of spite. No, OOO is one of the more classical philosophies on the contemporary scene. It's very much a continuation of Aristotle's notion of primary substance, that individual things are the primary substance. The Aristotelian tradition going all the way through scholasticism up to Leibniz, in which individual objects are primary and also substantial in the sense that they are not reducible to their relations or their accidents or their qualities. This is one of the easiest ways to understand what OOO is up to. It's a continuation of that very classical line. Where we differ from that classical line, it's in a number, primarily the fact that the Aristotelian theory of substance doesn't deal well with composites. It doesn't deal well with artificial things. Leibniz, of course, dismisses aggregates as being not real substances, as not having monads, which is exactly why I wrote the whole book on the Dutch East India Company, right? Immaterialism. And I chose that topic because Leibniz, in his correspondence with Arnauld, makes fun of that example, right? He says a diamond is a substance, but two diamonds glued together wouldn't be, even though an individual diamond in nature doesn't look anything like what we call a diamond. It requires a lot of polishing and cutting and fitting. So why would two diamonds glued together be automatically excluded as a substance? Or he says a circle of men holding hands cannot be a substance. And finally, he says all the officers of the Dutch East India Company cannot be a substance. And I say, why not? Why isn't the Dutch East India Company just as much a substance as an individual human? It outlasted a normal human life, right? It was there almost 200 years. It was the world's first corporation, and so it had many imitators. We're surrounded today by copies of the Dutch East India Company. You know, it had its own army. It changed the course of Asian history, no less than European history. So this is a very important and powerful object that Leibniz couldn't really handle, and certainly Aristotle couldn't really handle. Actor network theory can handle things like that, of course. That's one of the strengths of actor network theory. But again, actor network theory treats objects as actors in terms of their actions, not in terms of what is in them that is a surplus deeper than any of their actions. All right. There's another factor that keeps me confident about OOO, which is that I'm fairly sure that Heidegger is the philosopher of most lasting significance in the 20th century, and that's somewhat debatable, but I don't think it's a ridiculous case to make, and I think he might win the votes on that, despite the heavy burden of his politics. Heidegger might well win any poll of who was the most important philosopher of the 20th century, and I think OOO gets Heidegger right. OOO, the reading of Heidegger in Tool Being is, of course, unorthodox. It's gained very little traction in Heidegger circles. I've never been invited to a Heidegger symposium, as far as I can recall. They kind of held their nose and invited me to contribute an article to their journal, which they finally did a couple years ago. It's very common that if you find a Heidegger book that mentions me or OOO, there's usually a kind of sneering attitude or a sarcastic attitude. So we get nothing but hostility from Heidegger scholars, professional Heidegger scholars. And yet, go look at which Heidegger books are cited the most in the literature. Number one is Dreyfus, of course, the dominant Heidegger interpreter for the analytic philosophy. Number two is Tool Being. I'm sorry to say to these Heidegger scholars, it is very influential. And it may not be among Heidegger scholars, but among other people who want to understand Heidegger, I think they've gotten a lot out of that book. So these are some of the factors. All right. Anyway, I was saying those are some of the factors that maintain my confidence in OOO. But the real important thing that keeps me excited about OOO is ontography, which you may recall if you've read The Quadruple Object. That's my term for the fourfold diagram of two kinds of objects and two kinds of qualities and their interaction. And of course, I won't go through the whole history of that again. Anyone familiar with OOO will know something about that. But the idea that there are two basic kinds of distinctions. The first being the distinction between the real and the sensual. In other words, the real is that which withdraws, that which is always different from any relation to it, on the one hand, and then our direct access to it on the other hand. So that there is a gap between any relation we can have to a thing and that thing itself. This in itself is not a. You can find something of this in Kant. You can find this in Heidegger. So that's the first. The other is the less often discussed distinction between objects and their qualities. Something that I get out of Husserl. How do you get this out of Husserl? Well, he talks about intentional objects and their adumbrations. The fact that when you have an apple and rotate it in different directions in your hand and look at it from different distances and angles, it remains the same apple for you, even as the exact character of its givenness varies. And so there's that rift there, even though I will insist that Husserl tells us nothing about the real in the sense I mean it. Husserl is all about givenness, not about real objects. Nonetheless, precisely for that reason, precisely because Husserl confines himself deliberately to what I call the sensual realm, he is able to discover this new opposition there between the intentional object and its qualities. And this is very important, even though Husserl is usually talked about in contrast with psychologism, which is what he attacks. I think the more important contrast is between Husserl and empiricism. Because what characterizes empiricism in its classical form is the idea that an object is just a bundle of qualities. think especially of Hume, or that even I am just a bundle of perceptions rather than a soul or a substance. Husserl really goes for the jugular on that and says, no, that's not true. Even though he doesn't name the empiricists as his opponents, that's really who they are. Even Brentano was still taking the empiricists as his model. Brentano claimed that, what's the phrase he used? I'm having a mental block here. Experience contents, that mental life is about experienced content. That's what Brentano says. Husserl says, no, it's not about content, it's about objects. It's about object-giving acts. So in other words, it doesn't matter that the content varies all the time of your experience. There are certain relatively durable objects in your field of experience. And this is the core of phenomenology that gets preserved by Levinas and Merleau-Ponty and some others. So if you cross these two distinctions, you get 4 possible kinds of poles. There are real objects, real qualities, sensual objects, sensual qualities. And this gives you a grid that you can play with and see what happens when you do certain things to that diagram. And out of this comes Tripolo's theory of aesthetics, which I may get into, but it's potentially useful to any fields. And I hear back from people all the time who have found a use for it here or there. But again, primarily, it has opened up the possibility of a central role for aesthetics. What's the Tripolo reading of aesthetics? If you've read my object-oriented ontology book for Pelican, you will know this especially. The idea with aesthetics is that it heightens the rift between objects and their own qualities. So when you have an example of a metaphor like Homer's wine-dark sea, the analysis given in that book is that, first of all, metaphors are not symmetrical. Wine-dark sea is not sea-dark wine. Those are two equally valid but different metaphors. They communicate different things. Well, the wine-dark sea, what happens is one of them takes on the subject and one of them takes on the predicate qualities. The sea in this case is the object and it has wine-dark qualities. But since the sea can't literally be conceived of with wine-dark qualities, the object becomes withdrawn. You have wine-dark qualities that orbit a kind of black hole of the sea that has vanished from direct access. And since you can't have objects without qualities or qualities without an object for Tripolo any more than for phenomenology, what happens is that the reader of the Odyssey, the beholder of the artwork, has to step in for the object that has vanished and maintain and support the qualities, the wine-dark qualities that are still there. So this is the analysis of the kind of performative character of the artwork, the theatrical character of the artwork that has become even more important for Tripolo in recent years, starting with Dante's Broken Hammer. Also, the idea of expanding the usual discussion of time and space, time and space, time and space, the two things everyone always talks about because we assume that those are the two great magnitudes or two great continua that there are in the universe. According to the Tripolo ontography model, time and space are just two. There are also essence and eidos, all part of the same structure, because time and space are reinterpreted as in Tripolo as a different kinds of tension between objects and their qualities. So one thing this allows us to do is that anytime someone makes a critique of Tripolo, we can rethink it in terms of, okay, what part of the ontographic structure are they rejecting? Because if you disagree with Tripolo, it's probably because you don't think there's a gap between sensual objects and sensual qualities, or sensual objects and real qualities, or real objects and sensual qualities. It allows us to refine any critical discussion of Tripolo and focus on what the problem is. So, for example, David Hume would deny that there's a distinction between sensual objects and sensual qualities. There's just one thing there, it's a bundle of qualities. Husserl would disagree that there's any difference between real objects and sensual qualities. There are no real objects in the sense of an in itself for Husserl. Husserl tells us that the idea of a thing in itself that cannot even potentially be given to consciousness is absurd. And so you can look at Tripolo as a way of talking about gaps between objects and qualities. I'd rather talk about that than talk about Tripolo as being a theory of objects, because there are other theories of objects, such as Meinong's. What's really unique about Tripolo is the idea that objects both have and do not have their qualities. So there is a loose relation between objects and their qualities. And that is not anything new and certainly not anything faddish, because you can find this, for example, in Aristotle, all the way back in the Metaphysics. How does he define a substance? One of the ways he defines a substance is saying it can have different qualities at different times. So Socrates is sometimes happy and sometimes sad, which means that the substance Socrates is in some sense distinct from its qualities. Now, there are, of course, also qualities that a thing needs in order to remain what it is, but it turns out there's also a gap between those. A thing is not quite the same as its essence. Anyway, this is the basic spirit of the method. The idea that things are never quite identical with the qualities they have. Things are not bundles. And we can just study the interactions between things and the way that they compound and hybridize with each other, which is something we also get from OOO. Okay, so what are some other things that excite me about OOO even to this day? One of them is, I've already touched on it, the critique of literalism. The idea that if you have something to say, then you can say it in plain literal prose. Otherwise, you're messing around, you're being fuzzy, you're trying to trick people, you're just engaged in rhetoric of some sort. And this is the kind of critique one often encounters, obviously, from analytic philosophy, that you can just state things in good plain prose if you have a point to make. Well, that's not always true. Good plain prose is a literal form of cognition, and literalism doesn't always get what we're after. Imagine, I use this painting analogy sometimes. Imagine someone were to critique Leonardo da Vinci by saying, what's this chiaroscuro nonsense where Mona Lisa is in shadow and the background is kind of obscure? Just paint her in direct sunlight, damn it. That's good, honest painting. Of course, you would never say that in painting, right? A painter has to know the appropriate uses of shadow, as does an architect, as does a wine taster. Flamboyant and velvety Pinot, but lacking in stamina, which Daniel Dennett mocks as a kind of subcognitive drivel, is actually, that accounts for a good portion of mental life. That accounts for a lot of what we call good style and tacts, knowing what you can say directly and what you can't say directly, what you should hint. A tactful person doesn't say everything directly, right? A tactful person knows how to hint. And it's like that in intellectual life as well. It's not because you don't really know what you're talking about, and so you're just using words to obscure the issue. It's because sometimes hinting is the best we can do. As we should know after Heidegger, that you can't, Derrida as well, I guess, the idea that it's sometimes hard to put things in direct presence. So this idea that we've had in the last 400 years that philosophy, if it wants to be rigorous, should try to be a science. Husserl does this, right? Philosophy is rigorous science. In analytic philosophy, you hear phrases like scientific philosophy or exact philosophy, as though any rational person knows that this is what we should aspire to. And of course, in analytic philosophy, even the cultural specifics of the natural sciences are mimicked, so that you have, short focused journal articles on narrowly defined research projects, referring to other things written in the last 5 or 10 years, just like you get in the natural sciences. There's really an effort to emulate the culture of the natural sciences there. And in some parts of that world, there's an attempt to say that science is the ultimate cognitive authority on everything. As James Ladyman and Don Ross say in their book, Everything Must Go, which I critiqued some years ago, come right out and say that quantum theory should be in charge of the metaphysics of space and time, and Darwinism should be in charge of the metaphysics of natural kinds. I'm going to say no. That's not the case. That division of labor is one that I reject. It's a taxonomical division of labor. It's that science gets to talk about objects that are not human, and humans get to talk only about the human-world relation, which of course is then reduced to a lower status because it's not as rigorous or exact. No, I say that philosophy is a different sort of cognition from the sciences, just as the arts are a different sort of cognition from the sciences. And there are philosophical ways, specifically philosophical ways, to talk about object-object interactions. Obviously, the natural sciences talk about object-object interactions in terms of mathematical formalizability of these things, their existence in space-time conceived in mathematical terms. There are philosophical ways to talk about object-object interactions, and they aren't necessarily going to be of use to working scientists. They may sound like the old talk of substantial forms before Descartes started making fun of them, but don't assume that what happens in philosophy cannot be of use to science at some point. We don't need, several people say this. Why am I blanking on the name of the Italian physicist I quote all the time? He and Lee Smolin are often saying philosophy needs to stop limping along timidly behind the sciences, explaining what they've already done. They need to jump out ahead and give us their own theories. They need to challenge the sciences. Newton would have been considered, Carlo Rovelli, thank you. When you get to a certain age, you start forgetting things. Carlo Rovelli, thank you. at the time of the Leibniz-Clark dispute, Leibniz-Clark correspondence on the nature of space and time, of course, who was more attuned to the best science we have? That's always the phrase we hear from naturalists. We need to follow the best science we have. Well, the best science we had at that time was Newton's science. So of course, Newton won the debate with Leibniz on space and time in the eyes of most people. But Leibniz was closer to the best science we will have once Einstein revolutionizes our understanding of space-time. So I do not believe that the task of philosophy is to follow along insecurely after science, trying to please science. We have our own motivations for pursuing problems in certain directions. And who's to know if the OOO concept of vicarious causation may or may not be useful to some scientist in the future. So attacks on OOO from the scientific wing do not bother me a whit. Those people are harnessing themselves too much to where science is today. And actually, scientists today are nowhere near as dogmatic as philosophers who use science today as a big brother to beat up their opponents. My big brother can beat you up because I know math and science better than you do. That's not worth taking seriously at all. It's worth following science seriously, for sure, but not through the eyes of philosophers who use it as a cudgel for their own agenda. Okay, so literalism, art is certainly a powerful form of cognition. Oh, I should talk about knowledge first. Some of you haven't heard me say this before. When someone asks you what something is, there are really only two answers you can give. There are only two kinds of knowledge, basically. One of them is you can tell them what it's made of. The other is you can tell them what it does. I call these undermining and overmining. They usually occur together, so I call that dual mining. If you reduce a thing to its components, you're missing out on the emergent properties it has. And if you reduce a thing to its current action in the world, like actor network theory, which I love, you are stripping away its potential to change. Aristotle already saw that in the metaphysics, right? The Megarians think that no one's a house builder unless they're building a house right now. Nonsense, says Aristotle. A master house builder who's asleep still has the house building ability in a way that I do not. It's simply not exercised right now. Not all the properties of a thing are currently expressed. And this, I think, is the main problem with actor network theory. It is very phobic about actors having any properties that are not currently acting. It wants everything to be on the outside. Luckily for actor network theory, it doesn't require those properties to be properties that humans are seeing, at least in principle. It can be properties that are acting on other things, but even so, that's too limited a conception of what actors are, or what objects are. Objects do not express all of their properties at all times. Some of it is not unlocked by the current environment. So this is where I differ most from Latour. Art does not undermine or overmine in most cases. You cannot really explain an artwork by telling people what it's made of and the effect it has on viewers, because it can have different effects at different times. You can't mine away Picasso's Guernica by saying it's made of a certain amount of canvas and certain kinds of pigment arranged in certain shapes, nor can you explain away Guernica by saying it's Picasso's protest against the Luftwaffe's intervention in the Spanish Civil War. That's obviously something about the painting that helps you understand it, but the painting, if it's a good painting, can potentially have an aesthetic force 1,000 years from now when maybe no one remembers much about the Spanish Civil War, when other things have happened. And only a few historians of the modern period remember that Civil War. Okay, so art is a kind of non-literal cognition because only in rare cases, and usually bad cases, would you say, here's the meaning of this artwork and spell it out in prose terms. Paraphrasing an artwork usually does not do the job. I would almost want to say never does the job, but there are some cases where you can almost literalize a work. Philosophy, I want to put more in the same bag with the arts than with natural science. Why? Because natural science is a form of knowledge. Philosophy is not a form of knowledge. And don't take my word for it, take Socrates' word for it. Socrates has never been anyone's teacher. The only thing he knows is that he knows nothing. The great seeker of definitions never actually gives any final definitions in any of the dialogues. Philosophia, more generally, it's a love of wisdom. It's not a wisdom. This is why, by the way, I think that philosophy begins with Socrates and Plato. I love the pre-Socratics, but I see the pre-Socratics as the first natural scientists, not as the first philosophers. I think you get philosophy when you get the element of unknowability, which Heidegger claims is there in Heraclitus, nature loves to hide. I think you don't really get it until Plato's Socrates and Plato himself. You also get it in Aristotle, which many people don't realize. People think of Aristotle as a kind of knowledge-based philosopher. He's actually not. Aristotle says in the metaphysics, you can't really define a substance. Why? Because substances are concrete, but definitions use universals. In other words, There's a gap between language and substance. There's actually a gap between any kind of cognition and substance. So that's there in Aristotle too, and not just in the OOO reading of Aristotle. Okay, a couple other points. Knowledge is sometimes called justified true belief, or quite often called justified true belief. Why justified true belief? Well, because somebody could get the true belief by accident, right? Somebody could accidentally choose the right road to Larissa. And so that's why justified is added to justified true belief. And then there, Gettier gives reasons why it can't be justified true belief, and people have been arguing about that for 50 years. But I give a different reason for why it can't be justified true belief, which is that there's no such thing. You only have either unjustified true belief or justified untrue belief. The first is what I consider the aesthetic kind of cognition, and the second kind is knowledge. It's not hard to explain why I would call science justified untrue belief. Why is science justified untrue belief? Because it's never true. It never matches reality completely. I'm a fallibilist. It's always falsifiable. Even though I agree more with Lakatos than with Popper, the fact that any theory always has abundant falsifications at any given moment, but we maintain the research program because it works basically well. No research program is literally true. It's always already falsified. OOO will end up being wrong on a number of points. Maybe I'll be the one to find that, or maybe some of you will be the ones to find out why. Whereas what is unjustified true belief, that is when you are directly in the presence of the creation of something, namely the theatrical experience of an artwork, which in my view of aesthetics requires the beholder as one of the elements. Michael Fried, following Kant, thinks that painting cannot be theatrical, should not be theatrical, right? That it's the figures in the painting should exclude the beholder, even though later in his career he admits that's impossible. Well, I say that the painting is impossible without the beholder as one of its ingredients. A painting hanging on a wall after a nuclear holocaust where all humans are extinct is not a painting. Humans are a necessary ingredient of painting, just as hydrogen is a necessary ingredient of water. Asking what art without humans would be like is just as mistaken as asking what water without hydrogen would be like. And so humans are one of the necessary elements. Does that mean correlationism, which speculative realists are supposed to fight? No, because the fact that humans are a necessary ingredient of art does not mean that art is reducible to what humans interpret that art to be at any given moment. The art has a reality independent of my conception of it, even though I am one of the ingredients of it. Does that make sense? Yes, I'm one of the major ingredients of a psychoanalytic therapy session, of course, myself and the therapist. If I go into a Lacanian analyst, I have to be there for the session to occur. But that doesn't mean that I understand myself transparently, of course, even though I am one of the necessary ingredients of the session. The whole point of psychoanalysis is that you don't understand yourself, right? And you're trying to reach a better understanding. So anyway, there is no justified true belief. A couple other things. I've got, I guess, 12 minutes left. Okay. Also important in OOO, in my opinion, is one of my recent concerns, which is the new sense of formalism. What is formalism? Well, there's two different meanings of formalism that are opposite. One of them is that you formalize everything mathematically, and then you get all these self-reflexive paradoxes, like in Gödel's proof or in Derrida's philosophy. So you can read Paul Livingston's book and learn more about that. That's not, or Tom Ayer's book on speculative formalism, a very good book on literary criticism that also privileges self-reflexivity from a Derridian standpoint. That's not what I'm talking about when I talk about formalism. I'm talking about Kant's sense of the term. As far as I recall, Kant only uses formalism as a term in his ethical writings. I may be wrong about that, but that's really the only place I remember it. Where formalism in ethics, of course, means that it's context independent, right? It's not consequential. An ethical act has nothing to do with its consequences, good or bad. It has nothing to do with personal motivations, with making you feel good. An ethical act for Kant, of course, is one that is done purely out of duty, a duty binding on all rational beings. And so if you are doing good deeds solely out of fear of going to hell, that might be good for society, it might be good for you and for those around you, but it's not, strictly speaking, an ethical act. Certainly he's a formalist in his aesthetic theory, and later aesthetics has seen him that way. Kant is often seen as the godfather of aesthetic formalism. What does formalism mean in aesthetics? Well, the easiest way to describe that is the idea that artworks are self-contained, right? That they are somehow cut off from their socio-political surroundings or the biography of the artist, and you focus on internal, textual, or pictorial elements without paying much attention to the historical context or the economic conditions under which it was painted. And of course, this has long been under fire from Marxists, feminists, critical race theorists, any group that sees a problem of elitism whenever you're cutting a work off from its surroundings. And these are valid critiques. However, there is still something true in formalism. And that is that, to a certain extent, not just artworks, but every object is cut off from its surroundings. And I won't argue that case now, but that's one of the basic principles of OOO for those who know it. Everything is cut off from its surroundings. Now, what about specifically the arts? Now that I work at an architecture school, I see a lot of work, student reviews. I'm on a lot of juries. It's one of the things you do at an architecture school, even if you're not an architect. And I've had to learn architecture as fast as I can. But one of the things you do is you look at a lot of work and you make comments. And in architecture, a lot of work is said to be site-specific, right? That it's responding to the river nearby or to the history of the site or to the other architecture that exists around the site right now. And so that seems like an anti-formalist refutation right there, right? That a formalist architecture would be a bad one because it wouldn't be responding to anything at its site. I think that's the wrong way to read formalism, because when a work of architecture or art is site-specific, you'll invariably find that there are a finite number of site-specific elements. So the artist or the architect is going to be telling you about 3 or 4 aspects of the site that their work is responding to. But of course, any site has a countless number of elements, most of which are ignored, many of which are deliberately ignored. So for example, an architectural work might deliberately close off the sunlight of the site. If it's an art museum, you don't want direct sunlight on the paintings, right? And so the Louvre, to some extent, blocks out the natural sunlight of Paris, while it may be responding or maybe ignoring other aspects of the site in Paris. So every artwork or architectural work does end up being self-contained. It just lets in a small number of elements from the so-called environments and permits them to be part of the work and engages in dialogue with those. But those aren't really outside the work anymore. They've entered into the work as part of it. So the sense of formalism that emerges from this is the idea that artwork and other objects are still self-contained. You just have to broaden your sense of what counts as part of the object. The object is not just a physical solid. The object can also include certain contextual elements that are woven into the meaning of the object, while other such elements are excluded, whether deliberately or accidentally, by the creator of those objects. And I think this offers us a new approach to art criticism, one that I've tried to develop in a couple of works, such as my Lovecraft book, Art and Objects, another fairly recent book, and there will be others coming. Also, the book Immaterialism. I tried to apply this to history and the social sciences. The idea that, as much as I admire actor network theory, one of the things that I did when writing Immaterialism about the Dutch East India Company is ask myself, what would actor network theory say about the Dutch East India Company, and see why I wouldn't want to do that. Because I love actor network theory. It's the social sciences method I know best. I'm as big a fan of Latour and his co-workers as anybody on the planet. But there's, again, the idea that I have, that school of thought is treating things too much in relational terms. So when I'm looking at the Dutch East India Company, not at the biggest, loudest, noisiest events in the history of the company, like the biggest battles, the biggest business deals in which it was involved, but what I called it symbioses, stealing that term from Lynn Margulis in her wonderful theory of evolution and serial endosymbiosis, where evolution occurs not by the gradual survival of big fish rather than little fish and the reproduction of big baby fish and strong baby fish, but because at certain key rare moments in the history of evolution, 2 life forms symbiose. They form a new life form that cannot really be reversed because the 2 life forms come together irreversibly. And so I tried to apply that to history by finding cases of symbiosis in the case of the Dutch East India Company. And I found in the end 6, and I hypothesized that there's going to be 5 or 6 symbioses for any object, including each of us, over the course of our lifespan. And there have been some critiques of that book, but I'm still fairly happy with that book as a springboard for future research. And that's not the last of OOO you're going to see in social theory. So I'm happy with that as well. Another thing I'm happy with is the understanding of causation in OOO. Not vicarious causation, of course, is the most important of those. The idea that 2 things do not interact directly. 2 real objects can only interact by way of a sensual object, and 2 sensual objects can only interact by way of a real object. That's how interaction occurs. A 3rd object is always a mediator in the interaction between any two other objects. And of course, as I've outlined in my books, that is not completely historically unique. This goes all the way back to the Islamic theory of causation and the Islamic occasionalists of Basra in Iraq, starting with al-Ash'ari, the idea that fire does not burn cotton, God burns cotton, for which they have theological reasons. Then, of course, in Descartes and his followers in France and elsewhere in Europe, there are other reasons for saying that, the mind-body issue, God is the bridge. And then in Bruno Latour, who, despite being a religious person, does not call upon God as a philosophical skyhook at all, and tries to find local mediators. For example, the one he gives in Pandora's Hope is who linked politics with neutrons. In France, it was Frédéric Joliot, the one who tried to convince the French government to research atomic weapons. But then it ended up being too late. France was out of the war before they could research that. So he was the mediator in that case. And so OOO opens up this question of occasionalism and asks, how do two things mediate through a third? And we do it through the difference between real and sensual objects, which does not exist in Latour, does not exist in Whitehead. So that's a uniquely OOO problem. But here's the other thing about causation in OOO that no one talks about. Causation is treated more synchronically than diachronically. In other words, cause is treated as a sort of composition in OOO. Compare that to someone like Meillassoux, right? Meillassoux is hung up on the idea that the laws of nature can change in time at any moment for no reason whatsoever. So suddenly, next Wednesday, the laws of nature could collapse and be replaced by other laws. One thing, that's a very radical theory, of course, but the one thing that Meillassoux never really challenges in that radical theory is the idea that the laws of composition might be variable in this instance, right? So that, in other words, we might find that one orange is made of atoms and another orange is made of bricks and another orange is made of small horses. Now that would be radical. The idea that the same composition doesn't always lead to the same object, or that supervenience doesn't always function. You don't find that in Meillassoux because Meillassoux is obsessed with time. He thinks time is where stuff happens. And we have Arjan here, who's one of the critics of OOO's theory of time in a nice article he wrote. Nikki also to some extent, and Peter Grattan. They've all launched attacks on OOO's concept of time, which we're going to be talking about in April at that conference based in Nijmegen. But I would defend the idea that the synchronous approach to time is the best one. And if you want to read about that, you can read my article, Time, Space, Essence, and ADOS, A New Theory of Causation, where I actually interpret a midair crash between two airplanes in terms of the two airplanes combining into a new object, which has its own component features, which then detach and become independent again. But there was a retroactive effect from the crash objects on the two component objects once they detach, and so forth. So this is another thing about OOO that excites me. Okay. What about things that, we've got 2 minutes left, so I'll tell you things that I'm not satisfied with. Well, I'm never satisfied with the ontography diagrams. I've never felt like I've totally mastered them and that there are more that could be said about those things. But here are 2 other things that don't satisfy me right now. One of them is because I've spent so much effort trying to talk about the importance of arts and the importance of philosophy not being a kind of knowledge, this sometimes gives the wrong impression that OOO is somehow anti-science. And of course, that happens to actor network theory as well. People will say anti-actor network theory relativizes science, so the strongest scientist wins, which isn't really true. OOO gets this critique sometimes too, that we're saying that poetry, all science is a form of poetry because everything's a metaphor. Not really. There is an importance to literal cognition, obviously. The scientific revolution is still maybe the most important thing that's happened in human history. And I don't feel like OOO has done a good enough job accounting for that yet. And so you can expect to see more OOO work on philosophy of science, the practice of science, over the next decade or 2. Otherwise, we will have failed. That's more about knowledge and not just about why philosophy and art are different from knowledge and why that's good, but more about how knowledge works. Okay, here's the other thing that interests me, and it's interesting me more and more over time. This comes out of Bruno Latour's Modes of Existence, which is an interesting case. That work appeared in French in 2012 and English in 2013. Some of you may know it. It's much more difficult than Latour's earlier work. I was supposed to publish a book about this back in 2014, but I've been stalling on that because I'm never sure I really understand it, but it's in the center of my concerns, and here's why. What Latour did there is he went from actor network theory, which is a flat ontology in which everything affects everything else equally, and you can look at what things are by their actions, and realized at a certain point fairly early in his career that that's not all there is to the story, that there are certain modes in which you can't really mix because statements are made in different keys or tonalities. So you can't really speak of science and politics in the same way, or science and religion in the same way. And now we may disagree with him about the specifics. I think he mixes apples and oranges. I think several of his modes are ontological categories and others of them are historical contingencies. And so I'll be giving a critique in my book about that. But it's very important to look at how, once you start from a flat ontology, the way OOO does, how you account for the fact that the world is not completely flat, because we know it's not. We know that, Alexander Galloway said for OOO, humans are the equal of garbage because they're both objects. Well, of course, that's not true. Humans and garbage are not political equals. They're ontological equals. But how do we account for exactly what makes the political mode, or what makes the, one of the first most fascinating? He decomposes economics into three modes: attachment, morality, and organization. That's maybe one of the most important things in that book that no one's talking about. The fact that people call Latour a neoliberal. No, he's not a neoliberal. He specifically decomposes economics into three different modes. Economics is a misunderstanding, according to Latour. It's a challenging thesis. Anyway, I just wanted to end on that note, because OOO is not entirely a flat ontology. And so critiques of flat ontology miss the mark in that respect, with the caveat that in some sense it's my own fault, because we haven't done enough to write about those different modes. We haven't done enough to write about what politics and economics are compared to contrasted with ontology and so forth. So it's 10:07. I've gone 2 minutes over, maybe allowance for the time I was deconnected. I will end it there. And I think we go straight to Nikki, don't we? Or do we have a question period?
Well, first of all, Graham, thank you so much for this wonderful overview of OOO, and also giving a few glimpses on what you think will be future work. Very interesting. Thank you for that. Indeed, we have now planned Nikki's talk. So in principle, the program doesn't allow for questions, but maybe we can take one very quick question. So anyone who feels a question coming up, or anyone of the speakers here, show yourself, and I mean the speakers can show themselves, and the others I'm kindly asking to pose the question in the chat.
I've seen 4 questions already, so I'll just take the first one I saw, which is, can vicarious causation also happen between 2 real objects? Yes, that's where it happens precisely. Two real objects cannot touch each other, but they can touch essential objects. And how do we know a real object can touch a sensual object? Well, because I'm a real object, I touch sensual objects. And that's another thing we have to talk about. I totally neglected to mention this, that the difference between human experience of the world and animal experience of the world and inanimate experience of the world, it's sometimes kind of glibly assumed that OOO is a panpsychism. It's not. It's simply trying to deal with the problem at a level far more primitive than psyche. It's simply trying to say that when objects encounter each other, they don't encounter each other directly any more than I encounter an object. So the thing in itself is not some tragic human burden. The thing in itself haunts all relations. When fire burns cotton, the fire doesn't make contact with all of the cotton. So real versus real does not just mean human versus world. It means one real object making contact indirectly with any other real object, and it does that through a sensual object. And the easiest way to see that is the fact that we humans are real objects. I'm not an illusion for anybody. I don't exist just in somebody's mind. I am a real object, but I do not encounter other real objects. Principle of finitude. I'm encountering sensual objects, and sometimes in certain ways, something goes wrong in that that allows the 2 real objects to influence each other. This is what vicarious causation is about. So okay. I'll leave it there. There's so many other questions. We need to let Nikki go. He's going to give a very interesting talk.
Yeah, definitely. I can't seem to see the chat for the moment, but I'm going to try and solve that problem right away. So I can't see the questions at the moment, but you at least saw them, Graham. So, okay, we got one. There's still more time for questions. Just stick with us. And after our next 5 speakers, we'll have a plenary discussion session. So if you still have questions saved that pertain particularly to Graham's lecture, please save them until then. And now, without further ado, let's go to Nikki for his lecture. So I'd like to give the floor to Nikki Young from the University of Malta. Please, Nikki. I think you need to upload or share your PowerPoint first, probably.
Yes.
All right.
is it working in terms of,
It
can you
is
see it?
definitely
Okay.
visible. Yeah. Thank you.
Great.
So please.
Okay. Thank you very much. I shall be talking, as Graham said earlier, about his concept of ontotaxonomy, and basically my talk is entitled Ontotaxonomy and Object-Oriented Thought. Well, the concept of ontotaxonomy appears in a book published in 2016 called Dante's Broken Hammer. Of course, Graham speaks about this concept in a few pages towards the middle of this text, but he hasn't extensively used this concept since then, with the only exception being the only exit from modern philosophy, his essay published in 2020. Well, my claim is actually that this concept is very important in OOO. So important, in fact, that the fundamental ideas contained in his philosophy can ultimately be derived from precisely this critique of ontotaxonomy. Of course, I would like to prove that this is the case. So what I shall do in this talk is I will first explain this concept at some length, and then I will proceed to frame this critique of ontotaxonomy in light of what I believe are Harman's proposed threefold solution to ontotaxonomical thinking. Okay, so what is ontotaxonomy? Well, ontotaxonomy, if we understand ontology to mean the study of being as such, and if we understand taxonomy to mean the science concerned with demarcation and classification, then of course, if you combine the two together, what you get is ontotaxonomy, and what it criticizes is the deeply entrenched philosophical tendency to postulate a categorical difference, a taxonomy, between two exclusive ontological domains. Well, all forms of ontotaxonomy generally proceed as follows. They start by ring-fencing a series of supposedly outstanding traits possessed by a specific kind of being, say the human. From this, they then implicitly proceed to the unwarranted assumption that these unique and exceptional features, supposedly, ought to bestow this being, for example, the human, with an extraordinary ontological status, which serves to demarcate it from all other existence. So, for example, you can take the difference between human and world, for instance. There are human beings on the one hand, which are superior as moral and rational agents. And of course, this also includes their products like culture, creativity, technology. And on the other side, there is everything else, everything which is supposedly other than the human. Now, if we look at ontotaxonomy, there are actually two kinds, I believe. Graham does not speak about this specifically, but I believe that there are actually two kinds. There is gap ontotaxonomy, which postulates an a priori fissure between two domains, between humans and everything else. Of course, there are examples of this throughout the history of philosophy. The two most famous ones are Descartes, who postulates a difference between mind and body, and of course Kant, who draws a difference between the unknowable noumena and the phenomena. That's one kind of ontotaxonomy, but there is also a more recent form of ontotaxonomy, which is more popular in recent years, which is the correlationist ontotaxonomy. Now, the correlationist ontotaxonomy, rather than postulating an a priori gap between humans and everything else, the correlationist postulates an a priori correlation between humans and everything else. Of course, I got this term from Meillassoux book After Finitude, published in 2008. And basically, what the correlationist ontotaxonomy argues is that humans and everything else, being, whatever, are so tightly intertwined that it is impossible to think one without the other, and vice versa. Now, of course, both gap and correlationist ontotaxonomy are ultimately ontotaxonomical because they start off by assuming actually that there are two and only two distinct domains, and that these two distinct domains either need some mediational bridging, as is the case with gap ontotaxonomy. Or, of course, that the two are always already conjoined, like the correlational ontotaxonomy. Now, Harman rejects this ontotaxonomical belief that, I quote, humans are so utterly different in kind from everything else that they deserve an utterly different ontological category of their own. Now, needless to say, Harman does recognize that humans have characteristics which might differentiate them from other sorts of beings. For example, high-level thought and speech, the capacity for repression, and of course the fact that we are historical creatures. These are all examples Graham offers on page 230 of Dante's Broken Hammer. But ultimately, he believes that these are all differences in degree, and that these differences in degree do not warrant, of course, basing an entire ontology on this gap or correlation between humans and, of course, everything else. Now, there are, in my opinion, Harman identifies three main problems with ontotaxonomical thought. The first one, of course, is that ontology needs to discuss the features of all beings, all individual beings. And ontotaxonomy short-circuits this aim by creating this two-tiered ontology, humans on the one hand and everything else on the other hand. The second is that ontotaxonomy has a tendency to be thoroughly anthropocentric in the sense that it assumes a categorical difference between, for example, humans and everything else, and the world, being, whatever, or culture and nature. Now, finally, as Graham mentioned earlier, ontotaxonomy is problematic because it leads to an intellectual division of labor, where philosophy is left to ponder this gap, this exclusive gap, and the relations between different objects are left to the sciences. Now, I believe that Graham offers three fundamental alternatives to this form of thinking. And these three ideas basically contained in his philosophy are ontological democracy, ontological accretionism, and non-reciprocal entanglement. These are basically terms which I use and Graham doesn't himself use in his work specifically. The first ontological democracy is the idea that there isn't a categorical difference between humans and everything else, but rather that existence, reality, is made up of an infinite number of singular entities. Graham calls them objects, but we can call them many other things. And of course, he also maintains that each and every one of these objects commands equal dignity qua objects. So object-oriented ontology is a flat ontology, well, quasi-flat ontology, in that it prohibits the premature assumption or clear-cut distinction between two categories of entities or categories of entities. It involves the claim that everything is equally an object and therefore doesn't distinguish between the natural, the technological, the cultural, or the scientific. Now, of course, this long list of objects, cultural, scientific, etc., leads to the question, okay, this is an especially broad list. So what exactly constitutes an object according to object-oriented ontology? Well, I would claim that the fundamental negative, what I call the negative features of objects, is that an object refers in OOO to anything that is ontologically irreducible, which means, in other words, that it cannot be reduced down to its parts, what Harman calls undermining, or to its effects, what is usually called overmining in OOO. Now, but these are the negative features of objects, or rather what I call the negative features of objects insofar as they explain what an object is not. However, OOO also has more positive, it identifies more positive features of objects. Namely, it says that there are two kinds of objects, the real and the sensual. and that the real, they withdraw from relations, they exist autonomously from their respective relations, whilst the other sensual objects exist only in relation to some intending entity. And by intending, of course, I'm here using it broadly because, as some of you may know, OOO believes that all entities intend or prehend one another. Now, I certainly agree with people like Peter Wolfendale, who say that this is a liberal construal of objects. But of course, unlike Peter Wolfendale, I tend to disagree that this is a problem, because of course, I would rather begin ontology by with a democratic or liberal view of objects, rather than categorizing objects into two distinct things, for example, humans and everything else, as I've already said. The second move beyond onto taxonomy is ontological accretionism. And basically this refers to the rejection of the rigid distinction between substance and aggregate. As we know, philosophers such as Aristotle and Leibniz make this distinction between a substance and an aggregate. And they generally maintain that a substance is one and an aggregate is many, and so forth. Substances are natural, aggregates are artificial, etc. Now, the problem with this substance aggregate distinction, at least from a OOO perspective, is that it grants the status of substance or object to certain entities at the expense of others. And of course, it also creates an ontotaxonomy, a two-word distinction containing a fundamental layer of basic entities and another derivative layer of artificial, relational, technological aggregates. Now, in relation to this, it is important to point out that Harman seems to agree that that an object is both one and many. In what sense? For Harman, an object is primarily a unity. It is unified rather than made up of different pieces. It is an emergent whole. But on the other hand, of course, it is also made up of other objects. So therefore, it is, and I quote, a multiplicity that is also somehow one. Every object is fashioned from domestic relations, what Harman calls domestic relations between its component parts. But at the same time, I quote, an object unifies its pieces into an emergent reality which has genuine qualities of its own. So it is both one and many, as I've already said. Now, the concept of withdrawal implies that there is an absolute distinction between the domestic relations and the foreign relations, because the domestic relations are those relations which an object needs in order to remain in existence, while an object can vary its external alliances and therefore doesn't need its external relations. However, it's important to know that an object is not exhausted by its domestic or foreign relations, because of course it can lose any of these two within limits whilst simultaneously remaining the same kind of object. And therefore it is relatively ontologically independent of both. Now, of course, here I would like to dispel a popular myth about Harman's notion of withdrawal, because it is often assumed that withdrawal means that an object doesn't relate to other objects at all. Well, and therefore that it undermines the ecological view of reality. I've seen this critique pop up here and there by people such as Matthew Callarco, for instance, and the name escapes me right now, but there are other thinkers who make the same critique. I believe Levi Bryant once made this critique in a particular essay. I can't seem to recall the title right now, but well, I tend to disagree with this interpretation, because for me, withdrawal means that objects aren't exhausted by their relations, so they remain they have a certain degree of independence from these relationships. So basically, the overused and at times much maligned idea of vacuum-sealed actuality, which was actually developed originally as a response to Whitehead in Tool Being, if I'm not mistaken, simply means that an object cannot be dissolved into its relations. Now, the third part beyond ontotaxonomy, in my opinion, according to Graham, involves what I call non-reciprocal entanglement. Well, this notion of non-reciprocal entanglement rejects the ontotaxonomical postulation of a world made up of immanent, holistically entangled entities standing in opposition to human transcendence. As I've already said earlier, objects seem to withdraw from their external relations. Now, however, an object must also, in spite of the fact that they withdraw from their relations, it must also be able to relate to other objects, because otherwise no change would happen. Now, so there is a direct withdrawal from interactions, but also an indirect relations between objects, or what Graham calls vicarious causation. Now, how am I on time, Yoni? Am I good?
Well, in principle, you're 1 minute over now.
Oh, okay. I'm very sorry about this.
You can finish. And
okay.
We'll have
so
some
basically, for Harman, causation is vicarious, buffered, and asymmetrical. These are generally the terms he uses to describe relations. But I would add to this that causation is also alluring, binary, and aesthetic. I wish I had time to explain all these terms, but it would probably take too long. So I would just skip this part. Well, yes, that is basically the idea I was trying to put across, that these three features, namely non-reciprocal entanglement, ontological accretionism, and ontological democracy, are the three features of OOO, and that these three features can be derived from Harman's critique of ontotaxonomy. Should you wish to read a more detailed version of my talk, of course, you are free to refer to the two papers listed on the screen. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Nikki, for your very interesting talk. I wish there would be an applause sample in Teams that you could trigger as soon as a speaker ends, but there isn't, unfortunately. Anyhow, thanks so much. And we still have, well, we'll run a little bit into the break, a couple of minutes, I propose. But that leaves us still about 7 minutes for questions. So I have access to the chat now, so I should be able to see any question there popping up, or if any one of the other speakers would like to appear on the screen and ask a question or make a remark, that would be great. And of course, Graham, as the talk was about your work, you are also very much welcome to make a comment if you feel like.
I always agree with everything Nikki says. We talk a lot on Facebook. We've known each other for almost 4 years now.
Mm-hmm, that's it.
And, a lot of times he realizes things before I do about my own work. So it's usual in awe, and I have nothing really to add to what he said.
All right. That's a nice comment. Maybe while I'm, let me just double check that I have everything on the screen. Okay. While people are thinking about a question, maybe I would like to ask a question, Nikki, if you allow me. So those three aspects, the three fields you're talking about, maybe kind of relating to Graham's talk about, what do we think about when we have when he has a bad day, and what's the what gives us energy about OOO, and what are some of the aspects of how we see it evolving in the future. Of course, I'm talking now in the first person plural. He was talking about his own work, obviously, but you know, as a field, as a philosophy, which is Graham's, but certainly it's in the world, it's its own object, and a lot of people are relating to it and working in it. How do you see it evolving, and specifically also relating to those three terms you focused on? What are the steps to take from there on, according to you?
That's a complex question, as you can very well imagine. But I think that for a very long time, you know, the concept of object-oriented ontology was often associated and with the concept of withdrawal, and this is most certainly a very important concept. And I think we should begin by assuming, or by thinking of the object as relatively independent of its relations. So we need to think about individuality in some sense. This is, I think, the main idea which OOO brings to the table in terms of contemporary philosophy. It contributes to philosophy the idea that entities are always, in some sense, individual, that they cannot be dissolved into their relations or effects and so forth, as we've been used to hearing. But I believe that the future of object-oriented ontology requires that we also develop the ecological aspect of OOO. Because, as I said, we've have focused for too long on the concept of withdrawal, which is, as I said, a very important concept. But now we need to understand that object-oriented ontology is ultimately also a philosophy of ecology and relations. Of course, Tim Morton has already done some work in this field, but I think it should be expanded and pushed.
All right, I see Graham nodding, definitely agreeing. I also agree. I think that's a very good remark. It's something that's often, I think, misread when people first meet object-oriented ontology, that it's all about substance. Of course, it isn't all about substance. It's also a theory about relation, definitely. Okay, let me see if there is someone else who would like to pose a question. There are. I think your lecture was crystal clear, Nikki, because no one wants to ask something. So it was very well done.
I believe Arjen said that he might have a question to ask. If I can, from the comments, I can see.
I do, but there was also a question that was asked before I indicated that. So let's do that first.
Sorry, I must have missed it.
Okay, so indicate that, because I again can't see the chat function. I don't know what's wrong with, but you can see it. So if you'd want to very briefly go into that, please do so.
Yes. Okay. So I am fascinated by this is the comment by OOO. Is there a concept of responsibility of an act in a flat ontological world in which both humans and non-humans are involved? So I can't. If I understand the question correctly, the question is about ethics and how would this develop in a world where humans and non-humans are essentially on level playing field. Well, I mean, if I've understood the question correctly, I mean, yeah, this is a difficult question, but definitely we would have to, within the framework of OOO, conceive of ethics in a broader sense. And think about it, for example, in terms of an imperative of sort where even non-human entities offer challenges in the same way as human interactions do. So I think in order to answer that question, we'd need to broaden and reconceptualize our meaning of ethics to include more than just human object or human relation. I don't know if Graham agrees with this.
Yes, and I've always looked to Alfonso Lingus's book, The Imperative, when this question comes up.
All right. Thanks so much. Well, my apologies for anyone who still had a question. I do propose we have a little break now. Sorry, Arjen, I guess we can come back to your question later. And that we at least still have a break of about 5 minutes. So people can go get a drink or go to the restroom or whatever. And then we'll meet again in 5 minutes with for Lisa's presentation. So see you in 5. All right, so we're all back and Lisa is there. So let's start right away because we're on a tight schedule here with still lots of interesting talks to come. Also here, I'm going to keep my introductions as short as possible. You can read the bios on the website and find all the information of the speakers there. So please let me give the floor to Lisa Doeland from Radboud University. Where the interest in object-oriented ontology is great because one of the other speakers is from the same university. So please, Lisa.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to share my PhD research on the ontology of waste in the making. Tonight, I will, of course, reflect specifically on the relation between thinking on the about the ontology of waste in relation to OOO, and in my abstract I promised to also relate it to Morton's hyperobjects, but I don't know, in 15 minutes there's only so much that you can do, so I've skipped that part. So I'll start sharing my screen with you, and yes. All right. This is the end. We'll begin at the beginning. So relating it also to technology objects existence. When we think about technology, we think about things being very shiny and new. We then often have progress on our minds. And in doing so, we forget about the dirty things wearing down, tearing down, breaking down, becoming obsolete. In short, we forget about things becoming waste. So this is e-waste for you. But predominantly, what do we think about nowadays when we think about waste? So the dominant view is that waste is an object of techno-managerial sustainability, or differently put, it's a resource or should become a resource once again. So it might be a problem, waste might be a problem, but it can be solved by turning it into a resource, by what you could call resourcification. Meanwhile, outside in the real world, we find waste everywhere. So it escapes our managerial grasp and it piles up, it accumulates, it roams the earth, and it ends up everywhere in the water, in the earth, even in our own bodies in forms of microplastics. So from that perspective, waste defies this logic of what I would call a zero waste circular economy. So that, I think, captures the dominant ideology nowadays. So the logic of a zero waste circular economy without remainders. So in fact, so I will argue this logic breeds specters. So there is a kind of spectrality to waste. It haunts, it roams. And when we try to solve this issue or control waste, we find that it instead comes back to haunt us. And this is why I argue that we should conceive of waste as something spectral, as ghost-like. So when we then want to get a grip on the ontology of waste, we should take this spectrality into account. So we then need, I would suggest, a hauntology of waste, not an ontology. The thing is, I think that that OOO might be very close to an OOH. Maybe they're quite similar. I see some ontological, some kind of ontological approach in the work of Harman as well. Although he might disagree, being not a big fan of that.
Lisa, it seems you are suddenly muted. And the last thing you said was being not a big fan of the
Derrida, I think. Yeah.
All right.
So yeah, but we'll see. So I think that there is a critical potential to waste, which points to what you could call the dark side of eco-modernism, the dark side of anthropocentrism. That is very much in line with OOO, and but perhaps should be infused with hauntology. So let me turn to the next slide. Yes. So I'm showing here an artwork by a Belgian Beninese artist, Fabrizio Monteiro. I thought it was called Gods of Garbage, but that turned out to be the name for it by The Guardian, in which it was featured. Arjen Klein-Herenbrink sent it to me a few years ago. And I think this is fantastic artwork. So I wanted to share it specifically because he's in the program as well. But it's in fact called The Prophecy. So this is the Prophecy 1. It's a series of photographs in which figures of garbage feature. And Monteiro calls these figures spirits. I think they could also be called specters. And he says that they are meant as some kind of prophecies. And I take that they're meant as figures that that might warn us of things, of dangers, and also so figures that we pay attention to them. We should listen to them, which I think is something that specters or ghosts are also in the business of. They demand attention. They want us to listen. They have something to say. There's of course also an ethical element here. Yeah, taking them into account as well. But I'll leave ethics for now. So waste has a spectral quality. We thought it was gone, but it's still there. It's haunting us. As Timothy Morton puts that in one of his texts. So there's we seem to we live as if there were ontological U-bands through which garbage moves from one ontological level to another. And of course, in fact, there aren't. And so there's no away for waste. It just goes elsewhere. And the question, of course, is always, where does it go? Because yes, the waste that's depicted here is from a garbage dump in Senegal, the biggest one there. These are actually the people living with the specters of waste. We in Europe are not living with them very much. So as Brian Thiel in a beautiful short essay on garbage writes, so waste always comes back, just not to us specifically. And this mostly goes for, I think, for us in Europe and other Western countries. So another reason for sharing this artwork is that, so an artwork that actually works with waste is that from the perspective of the ideology of this zero waste circular society, even art should be and can be conceived as a medium that can turn waste into a resource. And in so doing, finding a place for it again in the cycle of production and consumption. So making it useful again, making it non-waste again, turning it once again into an object of manageable sustainability. What I think this this work by Montero suggests, and I will suggest it as well, but in writing normally, now in speaking, is that we follow Montero in taking the specter of waste as a figure that warns us of danger and not try to pacify it, or using a more metabolic imagery, trying to digest waste by turning it into a resource once again. So instead, letting these remainders get stuck in our throats. So before I turn to the spectrality of waste in more detail, so yeah, moving on to ontology, I want to first turn to OOO. So how to conceive of waste in, so now I'm doing it again, I really like the triple O. How to conceive of waste in triple O terms. So thanks for that, Harman. So in triple O, objects, they have a life of their own. So they're not reduced to our having access to them. They're not reduced to our relating to them, our knowing of them. So of course the idea is sometimes that there's no such thing as waste really. Waste is relative. It's just us humans deciding on things being out of place or being dirty, having to go away. So OOO triple O has a place for waste in its own right. So as Harman, of course, puts it, so objects are characterized by withdrawnness. They're not exhausted by their relations. So when we conceive of objects in triple O terms, they exceed our relations to them. So they cannot be reduced to a resource, for example. They become more than just the waste of something or the waste for something in the eyes of someone. So when we want to move from the ideology of a zero waste circular economy, we do indeed want to conceive of objects of waste as they are, not just how they are in relation to us. I want to turn now to a quote from Harman in an interview from 4 years ago. I have of course been looking for remarks on waste. This is what I found. So in this interview that was conducted in a I think a garbage dump in Cairo, he explains, or he argues that an object is precisely what it is when it detaches itself from its surroundings. So in a sense, objects and waste are two sides of the same coin. There is a non-relational aspect to both of them. I guess in the case of waste, it is still connected to its surroundings in a negative sense, since it hinders its surroundings and needs to be cleared. So what I draw from this is that I think Harman would argue that waste things are real objects characterized by withdrawnness. So they hold things in reserve. However, I'm not, there is a certain inertness to waste, something that does not seem to allow for either emergence or for change, which seems to be vital for objects, real objects in his sense. So specifically waste objects like plastics, they might degrade over a very long period of time, but in the meantime they seem to be quite inert, undead maybe. I'll return to that later on. So he also points out that waste relates to its surroundings in a negative sense, that it hinders its surroundings. I'm wondering, however, if this is something, so do we need to clear that? So that is, should we be able to shouldn't we be able to think waste things without wanting to clear them? Because in doing so, we disavow them, we make them disappear in a way. And in doing so, the critical potential that I think is important in, I don't know, battling this zero waste circular economy is lost as well. So shouldn't we be able to grapple with why these waste things are connected to their surroundings in a negative sense? the thing with waste is, I think that it lays bare the relationality of things, the ways in which things are in fact related to one another, albeit maybe there might be withdrawn aspects to it, but they're by resisting relationality. So they're actually resisting relating to their environment, at least in a positive sense. So waste accumulates, it gets stuck, it doesn't do anything, but because of that, it does do things anyway. So there's an ambiguity going on there. So it doesn't do anything, but it does anyway. So it is, in short, it's ambiguous. It seems to be both active and inactive, both present and absent maybe. And this is where I draw on Derrida, and this is why I turn to Derrida, because his thought on ontology as a pun on ontology, really, so the haunting, it might help us out here. So moving to Derrida, so I think that his concept of ontology that he introduces in Spectres of Marx can help us address these ambiguous things, these ambiguous objects as waste objects are. I will not turn into the details of this book. No, I'll just leave it at pointing out that his spectre, so this figure of the spectre that he introduces, mind you, Joni, am I good for time?
Mute. Well, in fact, like Nikki, you're already 1 minute over, but I mean,
oh, shice. Okay.
Take the time to finish.
Yeah. All right. So, so this spectre is of course a deconstructive figure, and it problematizes thinking in terms of presence, in terms of essences and identity. So this gives rise to an ambiguous state of being, not so much an ontology then, but a hauntology. So he argues very much against what he calls a metaphysics of presence. I think you could just say he argues against presentism, that I think very much characterizes this zero-weight circular economy as well. It's very much focused on the here and now, also from a consumption perspective on wanting things here and now, and very much not taking into account where things have come from, where they are going, both in place and time. So drawing on Hamlet's famous quote, famous remark, question to be or not to be, Derrida puns on this and argues and so punning on Derrida, he doesn't really do it himself. You could argue that, so to be is to haunt and be haunted. So that's what being is all about. That's what ontology is all about. So within a presentist or circular logic, we only focus on the here and now. And in doing so, we disavow how things come into being and what they will become. And if we, on the other hand, stop focusing on the present, we allow ourselves to see ghosts. So that's what ontology is all about. And we see then that we never start from scratch, that there's always something that's already there, and that which is present is never fully present, never really there. So adding to this, we then also disavow what he calls the wear and tear of things. So he writes that in an ageless world, we cannot measure wear and tear. So this ageless world would be a presentist world. And there is another Shakespeare quote, it's very much Shakespeare focused. So he draws on this quote: a painter in Timon of Athens remarks, it wears, sir, as it grows. It wears out, sir, as it goes on. And drawing on another text by Derrida on degradation, biodegradation, question mark, we could add that we should not only inquire into the wear and tear of things, but also in their resisting that process. So if anything characterizes modern waste, it's that things just won't degrade, so they just won't decay. So hauntology concerns inquiring into the relation between being in time, and more specifically into things living on, even things that perhaps should be characterized as undead instead of living on nonetheless. So then finally, last slide, last picture, a photograph of an albatross chick from a photo series by Chris Jordan, Midway Message from the Gyre. So very much secluded place, no humans inside. These albatross chicks died because they ate plastics. So there is something concerning biodegradation going on here as well. So this concern for the being of things in time is something that Harman addresses as well. So in Tool Being already, he argues that time is not some remote structure, blissfully uncontaminated by contacts with others, with objects. Rather, it is temporality acting in the heart of entities themselves, undercutting their claim to mere presence. And he stresses that the fact that objects are there does not mean that they have to last eternally. So they're not immune to alteration or decay. And so in doing so, this is a way to account for time, for change, so for the birth and death of objects. In immaterialism, again, Harman reflects on the birth and death and decay of things, and he draws on Mark Ulise's, he mentioned this of course already in his lecture, notion of symbiosis to account for the change of objects. So by doing so, he explains why objects allow for emergence and change. However, waste objects seem to resist symbiosis. So symbiosis, of course, concerns the state of living together. Whereas waste is not so much living or dead, but undead. It resists symbiosis while living on nonetheless. And also it seems to resist other objects engaging in symbiosis. So it seems to resist this either emergence or change, mostly change. So concluding, the thing with modern waste is that they just don't decay, at least not easily. So they don't lose their identity, they don't become non-things, they don't die, they don't become part of something else, something new. So they resist degradation of biodegradation. They accumulate, they get stuck in between life and death. And it is these undead spectral presences that demand our attention, I would argue, nowadays, and force our thoughts. And then the question, I think, is how have these objects come into being, and why will they not go away? So why are these objects remaining haunting? And I suggest it is because we treat them as if they can go away, as if they can change, becoming other things one way or another. In short, presentism breeds spectrality, so it breeds haunting. And it's when we lose the sight of the afterlife of things living on after we're done with them, that they start to haunt more fervently. And as such, it's a necessary consequence of the presentist circular logic. So moving from presentism to a hauntological logic, we should be able to allow ourselves to see these ghosts and specters. And developing an eye for the afterlife of things, and also for the ways in which some objects have a longer afterlife than others, and in doing so, developing, so perhaps we require not a triple O, but an OOH. So that was it.
All right, applause. Thank you so much, Lisa, for a very interesting talk. We only have 2 minutes left for questions, so my proposal would be that I first give the floor to Graham, if he wants to react on Lisa's presentation, because I think some questions are being asked here of object-oriented ontology. If you care to react, but your microphone is still muted.
Just very quickly, because I don't want to block all those who are asking questions. Yeah, there's so much to think about with waste. I first started thinking about this when I encountered Will Viney's book some years ago.
Yeah.
And obviously there are political problems, environmental problems, philosophical problems. I'm glad you dug up that interview from Cairo. That was, it was from the garbage neighborhood, actually, where the people, their livelihood is sorting the garbage. And they recycle an incredible amount, 98% or something of all the waste that comes through. I just wanted to say that I see the theme of waste as going throughout the history of philosophy in the sense that Neoplatonism, the emanations are essentially waste products, right? That something happens at one level, and then what gets emanated down to the next level is a kind of waste. And I think Neoplatonism is about due for a comeback. So there's my little clever side remark. I want to leave the floor open now for the questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you. That might just the puzzle might fall well as we have one question now, and we still have 1 minute. So please, Lisa, I think you can read it. Could we build a similarity between broken tool and waste? If so, can you explain how?
Similar, yeah. Yeah, probably, but that's something that I think, I don't know, I'm hesitant in answering that question. It seems like one for Graham more than it is for me. Yeah, because I'm not a big Heideggerian, so that's something that I'm not sure about.
Yeah, I think
Graham, if you like, you can comment if you feel like it.
Yeah, I'm sorry to take Lisa's time here, but
no,
certainly the theme of the broken equipment in Heidegger being is that which comes to presence, that which no longer fits in a relational context. Sure, there's a lot of that going on. What interested me most about Lisa's paper was she pointed to a certain ambiguity that the see if I can remember the way I formulated this in my mind during Lisa's talk. The waste is non-relational, but it's still somehow inert, right? Yeah. That's the paradox, right? That when I said in the garbage dump in Cairo that waste and objects are two sides of the same coin because they're both somehow freed from their context, the difference is that waste, at least to the first glance, doesn't seem to have a lot of potential for new relations. It seems like just detritus that kills albatross chicks and gums up other stuff. And of course, now we hear stories about people making creative use. That woman in Africa who figured out how to make ultra strong construction bricks out of compressing plastic and things like this. And one of the heartening things about the garbage dump in Cairo is how much of it they are able to recycle. They're way above Western levels in terms of reusing this stuff. So good use can be made of garbage by those who are willing to do it. But yeah, I liked in your paper, Lisa, the ambiguity you talked about, that it's non-relational and yet still inert in a certain sense, at least at first glance.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting relation to of course, the ecological questions as well. So I think there's very much an opening up of OOO to ecology there. But I will report on this later. Yeah.
Waste studies or garbage studies is one of those fields that I'm pretty sure will still be thriving 50 years from now.
Yeah.
It's kind of unfortunate that we need it, but we do.
Okay. Thank you both. And thank you for the questions. I apologize to the last person who still had a question, but I'm afraid we have to move on again. Time flies when you're having fun. So our next speaker is up. And that is Hans Alma, who is, I think, appearing now. Okay. She's my former colleague at the VUB. She worked here for 2 years, I think, but is now at the VU Amsterdam. And please, Hans, I give you the floor.
Thank you. I'll try and share my screen. I hope you can see it now. Is it okay, Joni?
Yeah. So you have to keep the slide somewhat in the middle vertically to, yeah, now it's too big, I think. Can you zoom out?
Okay.
Yeah. A little bit more? No? Yeah, that seems workable.
It seems workable. Okay, I hope it's still smaller like this.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Joni, for inviting me to this event, which is great. I like it very much, the discussions up till now. Well, I have to say I got to know Graham Harman's work on OOO by chance. when I was looking for literature on things to write one of the chapters in my book on ecological humanism. And I was intrigued by the book Object-Oriented Ontology, which I found in a local bookstore, especially because of the questions that were formulated on the backside of the cover. Are humans more special or important than non-human objects? How does this change the way we understand the world? Inside the book, I found the title of chapter 2, Aesthetics is the root of all philosophy, which intrigued me even more. So I bought the book and read it. As it inspired me and left me with questions, for me this is a great opportunity to be able to pose some of these questions to Graham Harman himself and to colleagues who know his work better than I do. In this paper, I would like to share with you how my search in the field of ecological humanism brought me to the world of objects and things, what I learned about them, and what questions are left unanswered. In his book, Facing the Planetary, Entangled Humanism and the Politics of Swarming, the political philosopher William Connolly criticizes the modernistic and dualistic worldview of many forms of humanism. But he doesn't reject humanism as such. Connolly advocates an entangled humanism that takes the inextricable interdependency of all forms of being into account, but that leaves room for human qualities and responsibilities. It is hard to translate entangled humanism into Dutch, so I work with the concept of ecological humanism and try to develop it in ways that are fruitful for the Dutch and Belgian context. Central to Connolly's thinking is the view that as humans we live in an impressive world with inexorable powers that are far beyond our control. At the same time, we fully participate in this world. Entanglement and participation are both key notions in Connolly's approach. Examples of entanglement he uses are that of bacteria in our bowels that influence our moods, symbiotic relationships between different kinds of animals, and the interrelations between climate patterns, ocean currents, and bacterial diversity. These entanglements point to powers that impact our lives in profound ways. In my book, I try to answer the question whether we can still speak of participation when we are the plaything of planetary forces. Connolly addresses this issue in terms of attachment and believing in this world. He acknowledges the challenges we face in this regard. Ideologies that used to give certainty and grip have failed us and are relativized by the pluralism of a globalizing world. However, Connolly argues that participation can take new forms in a pluralistic we that engages in creative practices. These practices have the character of experiments without preconceived blueprints. They do not depart from predictions, but develop on the basis of paying close attention to what we meet along the way. In this way, a shared concern about people's environment, for instance, the increasing drought of their habitat, can inspire people with very different backgrounds and beliefs to search imaginatively for possibilities for change. Their shared concern allows them to find values they have in common and to develop an ethics of cultivation. An ethics of cultivation is rooted in an affirmation of existence that asks for both care and struggle. A struggle against the destructive force of human actions that threatens life forms on our planet. Entangled humanism can bring groups of people together that commit themselves to a shared goal. But it also allows us to connect positively to non-human forms of being. I only came to grips with this idea when I visited an exposition of the Belgian sculptor Berlinde de Bruikere. In the exhibit's catalogue, she describes her way of working. She explains how she makes use of the material flow of the things she works with. Wax, epoxy, blankets, wood, that can be liquid, flexible, or rather stiff and rigid. Working with rather than against things allows her to act creatively without having autonomous control on what happens. Paying close attention to the material she engages, she creates something new others can connect to. Reading this description of de Bruikere's way of working, I was reminded of Connolly's view on an ethics of cultivation that asks for coming to terms in positive ways with the dissonances, dangers, and messiness of this world. It requires, among other things, an effective connection with non-human forms of being in acts of co-creation, as in the artworks of Berlinde de Bruikere. To further understand the notion of entanglement and our relation to non-human forms of being, I studied the book Entangled, an archaeology of the relationships between humans and things of Ian Hodder. In this book, Hodder focuses on the material things men find in nature, for example a stone, or manufacture themselves. Hodder's point of departure is that we pay little attention to the things around us, because we only ask ourselves what function they could have in our personal or societal lives. However, it is possible to come to an attentive perception out of interest in the thing itself, its texture, weight, nuances in color, details of form. Hodder's view on entanglement is based on such an attentive perception, but he is quite ambiguous about this entanglement. He discusses it in terms of dependence and dependencies. Things support us in many ways. They make possible the way we eat, live, move, work, play. We are dependent on them in the sense that we count on them, a dependence. But they also restrict us in our physical, economical, social, or psychological possibilities. The complexer things become, the more they seize us with regard to production, maintenance, and exigencies in use. Things trap us in dependencies that constrain human action and from which it is difficult to become detached. In fact, the solutions we find often lead to new, more complex and irreversible dependencies. In his article Entanglement and Relation, in response to Bruno Latour and Ian Hodder, Harman points out that to speak of entrapment implies an inherent dignity in non-human things, a certain autonomous character of both humans and natural beings. Harman agrees with Hodder on this issue, but he has problems with Hodder's admiration for the pre-dependent human at a low technology point in the historical past who had little objects to be trapped by. Harman argues that instead of withdrawing from as many entanglements as possible, we can renegotiate them. Instead of emphasizing the perilous character of fiddling and fixing as Hodder does, we can revalue these as the only technique on which any reinvention of the human can draw. From this hint as to what reinvention of the human might require, I draw the conclusion that OOO deserves interest in my search for an ecological humanism. In his book Object-Oriented Ontology, Harman presents OOO as a relatively new school of philosophy that loves wisdom instead of aspiring to obtain knowledge as science does. Harman just explained that to us in his presentation. OOO acknowledges reality as always radically different from our formulation of it. As the reality of things is always withdrawn or veiled rather than directly accessible, any attempt to grasp that reality by direct and literal language will inevitably misfire. This is where the importance of arts comes in. Art is not the production of knowledge about things, but creates new things in themselves. The artwork requires human participation to replace a real object that is permanently lost in its own depths. Art actively couples the beholder and the aesthetic object so as to produce a new compound object, a new object in its own right. In his example of the metaphor of wine-dark sea in Homer, I liked it that you just presented it as well. Harman states that the reader of the poem must perform the metaphor by standing in for the absent sea. Doing so, the metaphor builds a new theatrical sea reality. Harman connects this to the act of believing. I quote, "There is no justification for believing in a wine-dark sea, since it is not built from a literal comparison. And yet, this belief cannot possibly be untrue, because it creates its own object in the very act of believing it." Unquote. The aesthetic experience requires personal absorption, for we must constantly sustain it with our own being. As Harman says in an interview, an artwork that doesn't grab you isn't really an artwork. I hope I have done justice to Harman's position in this short compilation of some highlights for me. I can only end this paper with questions. The way I develop entangled or ecological humanism is closely linked to Connolly's view on participation and believing in this world. Am I right in seeing a connection between this view and the OOO view on aesthetics? Might it be that believing and an ethics of cultivation in Connolly's sense come close to an aesthetics that is sustained with our attentive being, with a participation that allows for the production of a new compound object? If so, what might it bring humanism if it insisted less on obtaining knowledge and more on philosophy's love for wisdom through the arts? I think Connolly would love this idea. A second set of questions relates to politics. How does Harman's view on a possible reinvention of the human relate to what Connolly conceives of as a pluralistic we that engages in creative, experimental acts or practices? Would this be in line with the fiddling and fixing Harman wants to revalue and the importance he attaches to an issue-related politics? I quote, "Politics consists of coalitions lined up around the boundaries of an issue whose exact nature can never be determined." Unquote. This is certainly compatible with Connolly's vision on swarms of pluralistic we's all over the globe who compensate in creativity what they lack in power. They need no political knowledge. They need an issue that can be disputed between various stakeholders, guided by what Connolly calls agonistic respect. Am I right in seeing parallels between the political thinking of Connolly and an object-oriented politics, And if so, what would be Graham Harman's view on the viability of an entangled or ecological humanism? I am aware that a good deal of these questions require my own continued research, but I would be grateful if our discussion gave me some directions. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Hans. I thought that was a very interesting talk, and which calls up many questions. Well, as such, I think, and maybe also with our audience. So questions are very much welcome. In the meantime, perhaps since Hans ended her talk with a lot of questions for Graham, if you care to respond, would be great.
Yes, Hans got the spirit of my article right, the article I wrote on Latour and Hodder's debate in the pages of New Literary History. For those who aren't familiar with Hodder's work, we sometimes encounter entanglement in the positive sense, as in the work of Karen Barad, right? The entanglement of matter and meaning, and she takes that sense from quantum theory, that the observer and reality are always entangled. She means that in a positive sense, whereas Hodder means entanglement in a negative sense, right? That we become entangled with too much stuff. And this happened at a certain point in our history, the Neolithic period, and now we need to radically rethink that because it's creating all this waste. To tie it in with Lisa's paper, it's creating a huge crisis that we might not survive, and so we need to get rid of entanglement. And then in that article, I suggested that I don't think we can do that, and that Latour's approach would be to take entanglement as irreducible and simply to try to renegotiate it. And I really enjoyed Hodder's book, but I'm more on Latour's side here. I don't think that we can completely disentangle ourselves from things. I worry that would go back to a kind of modernism of the lonely subject. So yeah, I liked what you did with that paper. I want to stop talking now, though, to open it up for questions from others.
Okay. Well, there doesn't seem to appear any question for the moment. So questions are still welcome, of course. Perhaps I could ask something in the meantime, which sort of connects both of you again, I guess. But that's, of course, what Hans was talking about. Your notion of, I see there's a question from Nikki now. Maybe I should, well, maybe we should devote attention first to that question, and I can keep my question for later. So Nikki asks, if we cannot disentangle ourselves from things, then would this mean that OOO is inherently ecological? It's a nice one. I presume this is first of all a question for Hans. But it also sounds a bit like a question for Graham.
Yes, I think it's more a question for Graham, but yeah. What I would like to say about it, well, I'm very much especially intrigued by your work on art and aesthetics, Graham, because I think it's of great relevance for ecological thinking. I mean, if we can think of a relation as a participation, like in the theatrical work of art, that we stand in for the sea, and that in that way we build really something new, then this would be, for me, a very interesting way of thinking about our relations to the non-human world in ways that leave far more space for ecological respect and the participatory way of engaging with things that William Connolly well advocates.
Right. I had a comment formulated and it's blanked out of my mind. These are the things that happened past 50. Your brain flickers kind of like an old television. Yeah, I do think, Nikki, that OOO is inherently ecological. If you claim that everything is relational and just relational, what you end up with is a kind of, the mesh, Timothy Morton's concept of the mesh, which I like. you end up saying that everything is relational and only relational. You end up with a kind of matrix or a kind of static world in which everything is already determined in its relation to everything else. To get to ecology, you need the idea also not only of Morton's mesh, but also his strange stranger, right? Which is the thing that is not fully embodied in the mesh. So I do think OOO is inherently ecological. Yes, there are, for various reasons, OOO has emphasized the non-relational because we're at a moment in time when the relational is so prominent, and when that most people are talking about that. But if it had been different, if OOO had emerged in a period where everyone was doing philosophy of substance, then I'm sure we would have talked about relations instead as a strategic choice. But yes, relations are very much there in the center of it, and I think ecology is one of the ways forward for OOO, as Timothy Morton has already become a celebrity through that very exercise.
Yeah, that seems to be kind of a shadow figure here throughout Hans's and also Lisa's talk a little bit, and throughout the comments. I mean, this is, of course, right in the middle of Timothy Morton's work. We should have had him here, but we don't, unfortunately. Okay, I see that it's 8:30 now, and maybe unless there's still a new question popping up, I would propose to actually take the break as the schedule foresaw. Just give people a little bit more time to relax and prepare for our last session, the last section of our program, which also includes a plenary discussion. So if you still think about questions to all the speakers, and of course, in relation to the interconnection between the talks, please save them for then, and do stick with us because the plenary discussion might, of course, get very interesting. Okay, so let's start again at 8:40. Let me first thank Hans again and all the people commenting and asking questions. And then we'll see each other again at 8:40. That's Brussels time. For everyone else, that's in 9 minutes. So see you in a bit.
Let me answer quickly this question from Brent, who asked, is OOO just a method of analysis rather than a generative philosophy? How do I approach working with architecture while avoiding the promotion of OOO as a generative formalism? My way of doing that is simply to try to stay out of telling architects what they should or shouldn't be doing. I try to learn from them. But I do think OOO offered some new architectural possibilities. And Arjan's about to start here, so I'll stop. Maybe this will come up in the discussion period.
Okay, I think this is my time to step in and to take over a little bit from Joni, who can just sit down and relax for a while, or maybe prepare his own lecture coming up as the latest. I have been following this discussion as an existential philosopher who is just as much interested in stones or oak trees or animals or garbage or humans or technological problems for that sake. And so I have now the pleasure and privilege to announce our next speaker, who is the second speaker from Nijmegen, as you can hear, well presented today. He's Arjan Klein-Herenbrink. He's an assistant professor in metaphysics and philosophical anthropology at the Radboud University in Nijmegen. And I'm happy to give you the virtual floor. There you go.
Thank you very much. So the title of the talk is Getting Real About Technology. Given the theme, I thought that would be appropriate. And I'll try to stay within the 15 minutes. So as Samuel L. Jackson said in Jurassic Park, hold on to your butts. With technology being the theme of this seminar, my question will be what object-oriented ontology might add to how the philosophy of technology currently already conceives of artifacts. And because that's a quite broad question, I will limit myself to a case study of Peter Paul Verbeek's well-known book, What Things Do, which precisely proposes a theory of concrete artifacts. And after outlining some of the highlights in his theory, in Verbeek's theory, I will argue that Verbeek's philosophy of technology has some serious blind spots, after which I will propose an object-oriented upgrade, so to speak, to his theory of artifacts. And the point of the whole presentation will be that this proposed upgrade would actually bring us closer to Verbeek's own stated intention of focusing on artifacts themselves rather than, quote, what they do or signify, end quote. So part one is on Verbeek. Unlike his precursors like Carl Jaspers and Martin Heidegger, Verbeek does not want to treat all of technology as a single worrisome phenomenon to be treated only in doom and gloomy terminology. Because what bothers Verbeek in these classical technologies, these classical theories, is their lack of attention to specific differences that individual artifacts make to the world. So Verbeek seeks a theory that does not reduce artifacts to, let's say, a universal background condition, to projections of our interpretations, or to reflections of our social and cultural environment, because all of these reductions would miss the active contribution that each individual artifact can and will make to the world. So Verbeek explicitly adopts Husserl's motto to go to the things themselves. But instead of a phenomenology, Verbeek proposes what he calls a post-phenomenology of technology. And this prefix post signals, for him, an emphasis on how subject and object do not just encounter each other in intentional relations, as in classical phenomenology, but also constitute each other in such relations. Mutual constitution is thus the key concern to Verbeek in post-phenomenology, and it means that objects and subjects do not exist beyond what their mutual relations make of them. For Verbeek, and this will become important later on, this implies that we never experience reality in itself, but only ever reality for us. And he concludes from this that, quote, reality is always reality for someone. So please note already the remarkable conceptual leap here, because from the tautology that we cannot experience reality without experiencing it, it is inferred that reality does not exist beyond our experience of it. This is an invalid argument, and I will return to it later, because it makes for some of the blind spots that I will address. But back to mutual constitution. Given something like, say, a table, post-phenomenology is interested in how a table actively shapes identities and conventions. So, for example, rectangular tables assign a head, low tables bring us adults to eye level with children, standing tables promote strolling from one table to another, and so on. So the idea is that we shape objects that in turn shape us, right? It's almost the slogan that you sometimes find in Michel Serres: we depend on the things that depend on us. And Verbeek will elaborate this mutual constitution in terms of 5 key notions. The first 4 are materiality, mediation, intentionality, and multi-stability. Number 5 is the denial that artifacts have private properties. And I'll quickly review each of these 5 aspects. Materiality for Verbeek means that this mutual constitution of tables and us and every other kinds of artifacts involves the artifact itself, not just its linguistic or symbolic meaning. So a speed bump does not just slow us down because of what it means in a traffic system, but also because what it will physically do to your car if you hit it too fast. Second, mediation means that technologies shape human-world relations. Such mediation, according to Verbeek, only arises in a specific use context. So the context comes first, then the mediation. Verbeek's own example is how in the Netherlands, the car only became to be seen as a means for long-distance personal transportation after a railway strike in 1903. So it took a shift in the context where cars were used for their new mediative role to emerge. Third point, technological intentionality. Technological intentionality means that artifacts actively promote ways of handling them, which should be a familiar theme for the Merleau-Pontians among us. For example, Verbeek suggests that a fountain pen would promote thoughtful styles of writing, whereas typewriters would evoke writing styles closer to spoken language. They would not determine them in a hard, necessary way, but they would promote certain styles. Fourth, multi-stability means that artifacts can have different, yet equal Multi-stability means that artifacts can have different yet equally real use contexts. So if I have an axe and I alternatingly use this axe in combat or to chop wood or as a wall decoration, none of these is the real axe underlying all others. Not even the axe that scientific investigations would reveal would be the real axe underlying all the others. The variety of axe appearances or axe usages is simply all there is to the Verbeekian artifact. And this leads him to the fifth and final and negative notion, namely that artifacts do not have essences. And on this point, I want to quote him. He writes, "There is one pitfall that needs to be avoided in the analysis of the ability of artifacts to co-shape relations between human beings and the world. This ability must not be conceived as an intrinsic property of the artifact itself, because this would give rise to a kind of realism in which properties would be assigned to objects independently of the subjects for whom these objects exist." End of quote. Given the quote, I think that most of you can see where the rest of this talk is going. Technological mediation and intentionality are thus properties of our relations with artifacts, not properties of artifacts themselves. As such, Verbeek holds that artifacts can only be understood in terms of the relations that human beings have to them. And he continues to state that, quote, "The insight that technology cannot be separated from its use context implies that technologies have no essence. They are what they are only in their use." And that is the exact same remarkable conceptual leap I mentioned earlier. Which brings me to part 2 of the talk, the blind spots, I think, that are present in this theory. Like Verbeek in his theory, object-oriented ontologies fight against the reduction of objects to single overarching phenomena. But unlike Verbeek, OOO also struggles against the reduction of artifacts to the plurality of their relations, a gesture Graham calls overmining. Verbeek's theory is a clear overmining position, as artifacts are said to lack being beyond their relations with others. Now, if you define artifacts purely by their relations, nothing remains with which such relations can be relations. So you automatically lose the possibility of saying that the axe initially used in combat, later to chop wood, and ending up on my wall is the same axe across various settings. You might object that the identity of the axe is nevertheless found in its material being. But for Verbeek, material properties are also not properties of things themselves, it turns out. Material properties for him are just further properties of mediated relations between people and things. And he explicitly holds this about matter as grasped in everyday awareness, and about matter as disclosed by science. Right? So the weight of my axe is not a property of the axe in itself. That is also something mediated in relations between me and the axe object. So even though Verbeek seeks a theory that can do right by how an artifact like a microwave oven is a food heater-upper, in his words, as he calls it, Verbeek's theory ends up saying that what heats my food is not the artifact on my kitchen table. What heats my food is a set of relations between the artifact and its human users. There is literally no other option on the kitchen table because Verbeek's ontology denies artifacts their own properties, which incidentally also means that there really is not a kitchen table after all, but that's a whole other story, because there's just someone's experience of a table, and this experience somehow has a microwave on top of it. Because as Verbeek said, reality is always reality for someone. This, I would claim, is a very special case of idealism. Verbeek does not directly reduce artifacts to human subjectivity, but he does reduce artifacts to a set of relations, each of which has a human being dangling at the other end. And this makes for several blind spots. 3 of them. First, it undervalues the bad fit between artifacts and their context. In my newspaper from last weekend, a scientist was interviewed as saying that 95% of scientific research is figuring out why your equipment won't work. But if artifacts are what they are only in their use, to repeat Verbeek's claim, such malfunctioning would not exist, could not exist. Because if an artifact just is its use, then it ought to function seamlessly in any context where direct rivaling claims from other users are absent. Second problem, the being of artifacts clearly surpasses their contexts. We keep things like nuclear weapons, firearms, and synthetic drugs locked away because of what they will do when unleashed in the world. And we lock them away because they already have slumbering properties that will cause catastrophe. And when actualized, by the way, these properties will remain more or less identical across highly different use contexts, a constancy also undervalued by Verbeek's theory. And finally, Verbeek's theory offers no room for object-object relations. Verbeek follows Don Ivey, the American philosopher of technology, in holding that artifacts can only have 3 kinds of relations. They can mediate human perceptions, as reading glasses do. They can be focused on directly, as when you admire a car. And they can help fill your experience while silently running in the background, as when a record player fills a room with music without itself being noticed. All these relations involve humans, which ignores that the world is full of conduits, pistons, circuits, sensors, and algorithms that primarily engage with other artifacts rather than with us. And this brings me to part 3 of the talk, object-oriented ontology. OOO assigns entities their own real properties, qualities, or powers. It does not do that by fiat, but I don't have time to explain the foundational arguments. Instead, let's just see what a OOO upgrade to Verbeek's theory can amount to. It would start by acknowledging that artifacts have their own private properties. This would allow us to do exactly what Verbeek wants, which is, again, as he writes, to theorize artifacts themselves and not only what they do or signify. Now, unlike Graham, I understand such properties in terms of powers rather than qualities, somewhat along the lines of Brian's ontocartography. But for our purposes here today, I'll ignore the differences between the 2 variants. Powers or qualities are generated and regenerated by the parts of an artifact, but they are emergent properties with regards to those parts. And powers are expressed in relations with other entities, but these expressions are emergent properties with regards to those powers, aka powers can neither be overmined nor undermined. So an axe manifesting as a weapon, a wood chopper, or a decorative piece are all expressions, manifestations, or sensual objects of the same object. No particular expression is ever identical to its underlying real being, its powers. By analogy, countless sentences can express my power to speak English, but no sentence makes said power present in an unmediated or otherwise ontologically privileged way. This dissolves Verbeek's main objection to essences, namely that the existence of essences would imply unmediated cognitive access to things in themselves. OOO simply offers theories of essence that do not imply such access. And note again that, as discussed earlier, it was never true in the first place that one can infer that artifacts have no private properties from the observation that we cannot relate to them without relating to them. All right, now, powers are not Aristotelian essences because powers must be forged in other connections with other entities and they can change over time. However, they need not change proportionately to contextual shifts. OOO holds that not all relations are equal. Again, by analogy, most experiences that I have change little to nothing to the powers that I am, yet every now and then some encounter makes for a profound change to my inner being. And the same is true for artifacts. Equipping mobile phones with the internet, thus transforming them into smartphones, is a real and lasting change, a symbiosis, as Graham might put it. Whereas putting a phone in a new case or hooking it up to a charger does not change the phone. And this disproportionality accounts for the ill fit of artifacts in their contexts, and also for how they ontologically surpass said context. It acknowledges, or allows us to acknowledge, the discord and strain that exists between an artifact and its environment.
Moreover, it helps explain why we can often anticipate what artifacts will bring about in the future. We do this by focusing on the lurking powers or properties that an artifact already has, right here and right now, and extrapolating how such powers might bring about change. An object-oriented upgrade would obviously also allow for object-object relations, which we saw were absent from Verbeek's theory. In all variants of OOO, relations between non-human objects are ontologically on the same footing as relations to humans. And finally, a OOO upgrade can facilitate what Verbeek also wants, namely to take up, quote, a situated perspective from the inside out, end of quote. With Verbeek, this insight always turns out to be a relation in which we find ourselves with an artifact. OOO can go one step further and encourage us to take up the perspective of artifacts themselves. Because once objects are seen in terms of powers, it follows quite naturally that an object can only register other entities in terms of the powers that it has. This leads to what Ian Bogost calls alien phenomenology. Just as Jacob von Exkuel famously imagined what a world would look like from the perspective of a bee or a tick, we can do the same for artifacts, and note that we already do this in some cases. In order to build a self-driving car, for example, one must understand and model how that artifact registers its surroundings. To conclude, if we really want to go to the artifacts themselves, we should accept that artifacts have private properties that warrant their ontological irreducibility to their contexts, and that their properties give them individual perspectives on whichever other entities they encounter. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Arjen. Everybody is applauding. You can't hear it, but we can, or I can, or I almost hear it. Graham does. So thank you for your inspiring and, let's say, deconstructing talk, at least deconstructing of Peter Paul Verbeek's ideas.
I must also add that What Things Do is by far one of my favorite philosophy of technology books, and Peter Paul Verbeek is one of my favorite Dutch philosophers. So everything I said was written in the spirit of admiration. I see.
We should have had Verbeek too here, I guess. But so the floor is open for questions. There is a question, but it's rather a broader question for Graham Harman, and I would like to save it for the plenary discussion. Graham, do you want to react first, or because I saw you nodding or laughing amused? Yes, you should put on the mic, I guess. I'm sorry, it happens with everybody constantly.
First, I want to second what Arjen said about, I'm also an admirer of Verbeek's book. And but if I were responding to Peter Paul, I would say similar things to what Arjen said. That's so what Arjen did is what I would also do in terms of entering and pushing back on Peter Paul's theory a bit, which I also admire very much. It's a pleasure to finally meet Arjen. He's one of those people who I only know him because he submitted a book manuscript to our series at Edinburgh, which is now the fine book Against Continuity on Deleuze and speculative realism that everybody should read. And we were supposed to meet here last year. We were supposed to meet another time when I was in Dortmund, and it's not that far from Nijmegen. So, but I wasn't able to work it out. So it's great to meet Arjen finally. And I also need to apologize to Arjen because he's the one person who writes very thoughtful questions via email that are so thoughtful that I don't have to think about them and I procrastinate responding, but I'm actually secretly pondering on them for months at a time. So I owe Arjen at least 2 substantive email replies from maybe months ago, and I'm sorry about that. It's not that I'm not thinking about them. I'm thinking about them every day. I just don't have an answer yet. But yes, I also share similar concerns with what you talked about with post-phenomenology. That the idea that objects also shape us isn't quite enough for me either, because you're still in an ontotaxonomy where we look at the world looks back at us. And a lot of times, I don't want to sound too harsh, I've written about this in several venues. When people look at the future of philosophy and where philosophy is headed next, it's usually a projection, it's an extrapolation from where we are now. And 2 of the most futuristic philosophers in the continental tradition, people who seem like they're way out there, we need to catch up with them. One is Schelling and another is Merleau-Ponty, and Blanchot is another. But if you're working with Schelling or Merleau-Ponty, it always feels like you're at the frontiers. You're way out there in this unsettled place where philosophy's borders are advancing into the wilderness. And these are nice philosophers, but the problem is both Schelling and Merleau-Ponty are ontotaxonomists in my sense, right? In the sense that you've got Merleau-Ponty, you've got the flesh, so it's the world. It's not just me looking at the world is pushing back at me, but the parts of the world are never really engaging with each other. And I have a similar problem with post-phenomenology, which I know is big in Belgium and the Netherlands, because for the same reason, that I think it's an advance beyond phenomenology. But if you're just saying the tools are shaping us in turn, that's not really the problem. The problem is that we're not allowed to talk about the objects dealing with each other. And that's something I would like to talk about too. There are cases where you can't talk about that. There are cases like artworks where I think you need a human as an ingredient. Maybe technology too, but unless that element is coming into the philosophy, it's not that futuristic. It's just Kant on steroids. It's Kant made wild. So anyway, I'll stop talking there for now.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, sure. Yes.
Because I think it also ties in very well with some of the themes that Lisa was addressing. Because of course, and also in that field, people like Timothy Morton, if you stress the fact that radioactive materials and plastics might be around having real effects on the world long after humanity may be gone, I think post-phenomenology as a framework is very ill-equipped, under-equipped to deal with that. Because what it can do is kind of imagine a human being on the scene there, right? And then you can make descriptions of what happens there, or you can try to develop an ethics out of why we shouldn't litter the world with all kinds of radioactive materials, because you imagine a being or another kind of organism that you might care about, or a cute dog or something, they're suffering the consequences 10,000 years from now. Whereas the entire point from the kind of work that Lisa does is, of course, that no, you're not going to be around, and it's still something you have to take into account today. And I think that is the breaking point where the kind of case where object-oriented ontology comes in and says, well, there might be a better or more fruitful way of setting up your concepts for dealing with technology if you want to think about these kinds of limit cases.
Okay, thank you, Arjen. There are two questions. I have questions myself, but as a moderator, you have to stay back. So I have one from Jan Jasper Maté, who is a doctoral student at Brussels. And he's writing, well, and I guess it's for you, Arjen. However, what do you think about immersive relations? According to Verbeek, I quote, "These are relations in which human beings are directed toward technologies that are, and this is important, also directed towards them in a bi-directional sense." Could you make sense of that?
Well, if it means what I think it means and what I hope it means, it's a great question, because it's the topic of immersion. I mean, not only are there some people in Nijmegen who work on speculative realism, but there's also a bunch of us who are very much interested in what happens in cases of immersion with technology, especially in things like video games. And my short answer about that theme is that I don't yet know what to make of it, or at least I'm not confident in what I think to say things about it in public. But and I was thinking about the same kind of question when Graham in his talk mentioned this OOO idea of aesthetics, where you as an observer have to take up the qualities of the object and bear them, and I can see on some kind of horizon how that might imply a very nice way of thinking about types of engagements with artifacts that are very, very immersive. But I wouldn't know what else to add to that. Maybe Graham has something.
Well, I see that there's so many questions, though, that I don't want to jump in right now.
Oh, okay. So there's a couple of questions from one person, and well, let's take one of them. Maybe the first one, who is primarily directed at you, Arjen, again. So if you can make it short, because I can see Joni is already impatiently waiting to give his talk. But so Benjamin Horn is asking, coming from literary criticism, what do you think of the use of fiction, such as science fiction, as a kind of technology or upgrade to doing things with words? Arjen, how about that?
I would be completely for it. I just don't agree with the second part of the question, that the science fiction would work by metaphorizing the world. I absolutely don't think that that is what science fiction does. I happen to think that that is what fantasy does, but that's a whole thing that I'm not going to go into tonight, because that would ruin everything for everyone. But it's a good question.
Graham, do you have something to add here? I see you nodding, or?
I actually have something to add to the next question. I've seen both of these on the chat window.
Please go ahead.
Benjamin also asked about the idea of genre as a triple O object. I would see the idea of genre as something more similar to Latour's idea of modes, right? That objects are still at the level of flat ontology, whereas a genre would be a kind of micro world in which certain things become relevant, because you seem to be talking about how a genre can change the meaning of a sentence, right? Her world exploded can mean a different thing in realist literature or in science fiction. That's more like a Latourian mode to me, in which different statements can mean different things according to the mode in which they are uttered. So that's how I would approach it.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's dark here and it's 8 minutes past 9. So we're slowly moving toward a plenary discussion, but not, of course, not without my dear colleague Joni van den Ede giving his talk. Well, as far as necessary, I still introduce him. He's not only latently interested in country music, I know that as a matter of fact, but he's also my dear colleague, of course, at the VUB here in Brussels, and a senior researcher, lecturer at the Center of Ethics, and as well, the very organizer of this event tonight. So you have the floor. You know you have to stick to the timetable as good as you can. And before giving you the floor, I would want, of course, to thank you, Arjen, for your very nice talk. Stay with us.
Thank you.
There's in a moment also the plenary discussion. So Joni, now the virtual floor is fully yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I think in this last lecture of the day, before we do have the plenary discussion, I think I can pick up on a couple of threads that have been growing throughout the evening. So let's see where this gets us. Okay, since its inception, OOO has been a topic for intense metaphysical discussion. But for me, I've discovered throughout the years its value is first and foremost existential and pragmatic. It helps me live. Going through the world wearing OOO glasses, we become friends to uncertainty. The obscure gets less threatening. Half-knowing becomes a life philosophy. Mind you, the dark doesn't suddenly turn into light. That was old school metaphysics business. It's the almost Eastern realization that light and dark belong together, that every coin, but truly every coin, has a flip side. Referencing OOO's existential use in this way might be startling. The question, what is OOO's use? And some have already remarked on related questions. So what is OOO's use that is, for us humans, seems an impossible one. Two of OOO's foundational moves preempted. First, its anti-anthropocentrism prevents an exclusive human focus. Second, asking about the use of things plays into the hands of one of OOO's main conceptual adversaries, pragmatism. Graham Harman's philosophy is exactly founded on bypassing the pragmatist reading of Heidegger's tool analysis and subsequently widening its scope beyond Dasein to all things. It is the case that in the wider OOO landscape, beyond its dominant focus on ontology, traces of existential or pragmatic stock-taking can be found, such as in the work of Morton, Bogost, Garcia, or Klein Herenbrink. Overall, however, OOO has really only brushed against existential issues. To strengthen this connection seems crucial to me. And it becomes all the more relevant given the emergence of one of the most important hyperobjects, with a term of Morton, of the current and coming era, the algorithmic thing. Algorithms are, apart from viruses perhaps, the object in an object-oriented sense to reckon with nowadays. Algorithmization, as I like to call it, pierces through to all domains of life, markets, administration, health, education, social interaction, etc. All of these become increasingly shaped, monitored, and steered by algorithms through mediation by apps, bots, wearables, cloud services, and the like. Things that were formerly regarded without much ambivalence as typically human activities or characteristics, such as decision-making, behavior influencing, learning, and cognition, become now distributed across human-machine networks. Despite this distribution, however, our mindset is still largely Cartesian. We have the hardest time seeing, feeling this interrelation. But will nurturing a relational mindset do? Don't we need more? With things acquiring a backside of code, algorithms, data, that always withdraws, but all the while invisibly shapes the front side that we see and interact with, we could also benefit from an approach that wants to account for hidden realities. And indeed, for instance, in design studies, OOO has been applied to make sense of the object perspective of smart, that is, algorithmically mediated things. There is nevertheless a crucial caveat. OOO piques our interest in objects' hidden real core, that which simmers beneath the surface, and of which we occasionally just receive glimpses. So an application to smart things would seem a natural fit. Yet from a OOO point of view, algorithmic things do not differ essentially from other objects. Ontologically, all objects alike harbor a hidden kernel. So how to distinguish on this level algorithmically mediated things from other things? We simply cannot. Then again, given the predicament, this might exactly turn out to be OOO's greatest strength. One of the problems I see in the artificial intelligence debate is that AI gets reified as the new thing to study. Whereas in everyday life, AI almost never shows itself as AI. We perceive the results of algorithmic processes, but these rather appear as the new normal. Certainly after a while, as we get used to the recommendations, suggestions, prods, and nudges. The process, the nudging, the steering is meant to stay cloaked. Wouldn't we be better off then with a perspective that is not so much oriented towards AI specifically, but that helps us nourish an attitude expectant of hidden realities in general? Hence, there is still a task reserved here for OOO, but it is not precisely what we would expect on the basis of that too obvious appeal of accounting for algorithmic things' purported inner life. No, it is to sharpen our senses as such for the invisible, for the absent, not so much as an ontological exercise, but as an existential concern. This is the pragmatic value of OOO. Yet, in order to fully bring this out, we require a pragmatist rereading of OOO, indeed deliberately going against the grain of its inbred distrust of pragmatism. I cannot possibly be exhaustive here. I have a book project on this theme underway, but offer in the remainder of my paper a few pointers turning to none other than the pragmatist philosopher, perhaps most elaborately discussed by Harman in Tool Being, Richard Rorty. Surely nothing seems more anathema to OOO's anti-anthropocentric realism than Rorty's pragmatist historicism. With a quote from Rorty, "Reality as it is in itself, apart from human needs and interests, is, in my view, just another of the obsequious names of God." End of quote. There are plenty of passages like this in his work where Rorty refers to philosophy's, quote, heartfelt devotion to realism, end of quote, as, quote, the Enlightenment's version of the religious urge to bow down before a non-human power, end of quote. Even in his later, less epistemological, more literary conceptualization of the ironist position, he sticks to his guns as concerns this assured anti-realist stance. Consider the following excerpt from Contingency, Irony and Solidarity from 1989. She, the ironist, does not think that her vocabulary is closer to reality than others, that it is in touch with a power, not herself. Ironists who are inclined to philosophize see the choice between vocabularies as made neither within a neutral and universal meta-vocabulary, nor by an attempt to fight one's way past appearances to the real, but simply by playing off the new against the old. End of quote. How OOO can one get? And yet in this passage lies dormant, to use a OOO term, a viewpoint in fact very akin to Harman's. But let's look briefly at Harman's Rorty critique in Tool Being first. Harman refers there to a paper in which Rorty distinguishes between type A and type B entities. Type A entities are essences or substances in the classic sense, and of course the philosophical concepts Rorty would like to get rid of. Type B entities, by contrast, are relational. Only these we should preserve. Thus, Harman argues, Rorty misreads Heidegger's stool analysis as a pragmatist account of how the world acquires meaning solely through human interpretation and practice. This is, of course, the well-known critique by OOO of the pragmatist interpretation of Heidegger. Harman's response will be that type A entities do exist. Tool Being is a type A entity, is an essence. However, not in the sense that Rorty envisions, not a, with a quote, a present at hand atom that explains other beings while being inexplicable in its own right, end of quote. That was a quote from Harman. Foreshadowing his later undermining-overmining distinction, Harman proposes there must be a third option, his own notion, of course, of the real and of essence. Indeed, all hinges on what is meant by real and essence. And I think this very much refers also to what Arjen was talking about. Harman's reading seems justified. Rorty does fall victim to correlationism, and though his battle against essentialism remains invaluable, his reduction of everything to human practice, to social utility, leaves a lot to be answered for. On the other hand, this shouldn't keep us from asking how, conversely, OOO could be made useful in a pragmatic perspective. Thus, let's stretch the notion of the real, of essence, and then re-import it into the project of how to live and see what happens. A first hunch that puts us in that direction is that Harman's work has an indelible Rortian feel to it. Both, one may say, are continental thinkers with an analytic writing style, a combination I personally hold dear. But the convergences go much further. Making abstraction from the aforementioned differences, we can see both preferring a perspectival view, in which the world appears in its tremendous multiplicity and richness. Harman and Rorty share the endeavor of showing there is always something more. In Harman's case, not everything can be reduced to relation, for there is a more, which is the real. With Rorty, instead of reducing the world to a few essences to one big overarching story, we should listen to and come up with always more stories. Whether it concerns the individual or society, as in Rorty's case, or any other thing, as with Harman, we are invited to take the standpoint of get acquainted with the other, but always from out of our very own perspective, which is the only one we actually have at our disposal. What Rorty describes as stories, narratives, or vocabularies, Harman tries to make sense of as the coming about, growth, flourishing, and decay of objects. And while the former stance requires us to always cultivate an admiration for the power of strangers, with this beautiful Rorty phrase, the Harmonian lens teaches us to look at the world in constant expectation of surprise. We are put to the task of always redescribing, with the Rortian term, the world and ourselves, just like objects continually shift, morph, combine into new objects. Accordingly, for both, truth is an overestimated notion. That is, truth understood as knowledge, as absolute correspondence, fully graspable in categories, definitions, models, data, and the like. Is not Rorty's preference for the quest for wisdom over the quest for certainty, with a quote, related in spirit to Harman stressing the roots of philosophia, the original Socratic longing for wisdom, never reaching a clearly delineable endpoint? Rorty seems to want to bypass philosophy altogether, pleading for a post-philosophical culture, but mind the capital P marking the kind of essence-seeking philosophies that Rorty seeks to abandon. Philosophy still has a place, but shouldn't arrogate that it lords over all other fields. Likewise, Harman states, quote, each domain, the humanities, physics, chemistry, has its realities, which are not reducible to where they came from. Object-oriented philosophy does not reduce, end of quote. Rorty would say vocabularies are incommensurable. Along those lines, both eventually arrive at an aesthetic position, with Harman earmarking aesthetics as the root of all philosophy, and Rorty, with Dewey, favoring aesthetic enhancement over objective cognition as a cultural ideal. And so let's return to the quote from before. Surely the ironist wouldn't think she is closer to reality than others. Reality can be reached anyhow. Nor can she be in touch with the power not herself, not directly at least. Fighting one's way past appearances to the real may be the central speculative realist move, but OOO does not believe this quest can ever be completed. Rather, it is a way of playing the new off against the old, in Rorty's words, the ever-ongoing circus of objects coming into and going out of existence. So the Harmanian real is everything but a Rortyian essence, as Harman indeed pointed out from the start. On the contrary, OOO in fact argues as much as Rorty that nothing can be reduced to an essence. That is, essence as presence. Now, how to confront algorithmic invisibility with this? I can only provide an indication here in closing. Although, as mentioned, we may be talking about different types of invisibility and visibility, OOO can help us to come to grips with algorithmic mediation by instilling in us an attitude of expectation that beyond appearances, relation, a deeper reality lies. And this is very much a Rortyian idea. The ironist moves through life half sure, half unsure about her final vocabulary, always on the lookout for conversation with and enrichment by new vocabularies. The key must lie in acquiring this sensibility, which is, with a Rorty quote that could just as well have been Harman's, that openness to strangeness, I'll repeat that openness to strangeness, which initially tempted us to begin thinking. End of quote, and end of my paper.
Great. Thank you, Joni, for your, well, what shall we say, energetic, heartfelt, passionate paper that both brings in things about Richard Rorty. We should have had him too, but that would have been fairly impossible. And of course, linking him to Graham Harman's theory, both leading them into an aesthetic position in the end. So Graham, it's only fair that you can have a first reaction, I think, here. Please, you have the floor.
Sure, and I'll try to keep it quick again. But I totally agree with Joni that the connection with Rorty is there, even though on the surface he looks like the very embodiment of anti-OOO. I've always liked his style. I've always had a lot of time for Rorty. Also, if I can share briefly an anecdote, there's an important moment in every intellectual career. We can call it a coming of age moment, where for your whole early life, you're a student, you're doing practice exercises, and there always comes a moment when you're taken seriously for the first time by some adult thinker, and that's always a breakthrough. And I've written about what it meant for me to get to know Bruno Latour in my early 30s and how empowering that was for me. But there was actually an earlier moment that involved Richard Rorty, which is that I read something he said about Latour, and I wrote Rorty a very polite letter. I was just a graduate student, and said he's misinterpreting Latour as a social constructionist, and Latour is actually more complicated than that. And a few weeks later, I get a very nice, generous back from Richard Rorty. He doesn't know me from a hole in the wall, telling me that I was right, and that meant a lot to me. Wow. Not so much on that question. I still have that letter somewhere. Just thinking, wow, Richard Rorty, he's this star. He didn't even have to respond to me. And I'm sure I'm just this graduate student living in Chicago, having a hard time with my advisor getting my proposal through, but it meant a lot to me. So I've always appreciated that, and I've always appreciated others who do that for young people. And I've tried to do that myself when possible, because it really frees people to take them seriously like that when they're just starting. So that's what I wanted to say about Rorty, in honor of his memory. I wish he were still with us. I never did meet him in person. And then I'll make one other quick comment about the existential impact of OOO that Yoni talks about. This is a case where I think for strategic reasons, OOO was trying to de-emphasize the human side of Heidegger, because Dasein overshadows most readings of Heidegger. And so I took this anti-human focus when I was writing Tool Being. And then the first time I reread Being and Time after writing Tool Being, the biggest surprise I had was how good the existential analyses of Dasein are. I thought, wow, these are actually really good. I was giving these short shrift, all this stuff about ambiguity and fallenness and Das Man. Well, that's really good, actually. Heidegger's not bad on this stuff at all. There's a lot in here we can learn from. And I think the recent emphasis on theatricality in OOO is maybe my way of working back into that lane and talking about human stuff. So you're definitely right about that, Yoni.
Yeah, that's interesting. Great. That's a great comment.
Okay, thank you, Graham, also for the anecdote, which is also always a nice thing to hear. So I'm looking with one eye to the chat, and I don't see any questions there, but I can see our distinguished speakers, or at least some of them have put their camera on. No, there is one, as a matter of fact, from Samuel van der Veken. I just read it as it just comes in, together with you. This is a very personal question. Well, and might be related to invisibility, but is there for Yoni or any of the other speakers a link between OOO and the idea of emptiness in Buddhism? More specifically, the notions of impermanence and dependent arising. Well, you brought up religiousness and God, Yoni. Of course, that doesn't need to go to Buddhism, but maybe you can pick up on it, and then.
Yeah. I think this is a great question. And I can see how Samuel believes it's a personal question, but it is at the same time also very much a conceptual question, and one I am well, not in a direct sense with exactly that question, but I am occupied with or engaged with that kind of topic as well in the greater project that I'm working on, and of which this was just a slice. But well, maybe to keep my answer as short as possible, but I do definitely think there is convergence here. Maybe I think your question is pointing in another direction than the one I'm thinking in my work. But I do definitely think there is a vibration or a resonance between the more Eastern idea of, presence, but then of course not presence in a Heideggerian sense, but presence as being here and now, and sort of the OOO perspective, and even the Rortian perspective, and that might even be what they at the deepest core of the object that is the combination of Rortian pragmatism and Harman's philosophy. That might even be what what connects them in a way. And maybe I'm exaggerating now, but in any case, I do think there is a lot of resonance here. So I think you're definitely on an interesting track with your question.
Timothy Morton has a lot of thoughts about Buddhism and OOO. He might be somebody to contact about that. And personally, one of my goals in life is to try to attain a totally global perspective on all the different kinds of philosophy that exist. I've been trying to do that cautiously and privately, because I think if we do it too fast, we end up being too quick to say that everything in Chinese philosophy is like everything in Kierkegaard. I'm worried about doing that too quickly and trying to make sure it's being approached at the proper level. So what I've tried to do is focus on broadening the concept of Western philosophy so that it includes Islamic philosophy. Because when you're talking about Chinese or Indian philosophy, you're talking about something very different with different historical roots. When you're talking about Islamic philosophy, you're talking about an offshoot of Greek philosophy. And we already don't consider that enough. And that's already a kind of internal exoticism that we need to overcome. and bring those two traditions into dialogue. But then further on, I'm teaching Chinese philosophy next year and Indian philosophy the year after that, and I'm slowly attaining competence in these fields. So we need to have that on our radar. Western philosophy cannot dominate the discussion. I just want to be cautious about it personally, and stating amateurish opinions about traditions I haven't mastered. That's all.
And probably never will, since that's the whole idea of these religious perspectives, of course.
Yes.
Thank you, Graham, for adding up on this. There are some questions, broader ones, and I guess we can slowly, unless there are questions for Yoni specifically, and thank you, Yoni, for your talk. We can slowly move to the plenary discussion, and if I may, so these are questions that are valid then for everybody. So please feel free to pick up on them. So there's a first question from Poland, Krakow. Good evening, from Michael Dudek, who's presenting himself, and then, if I may say so, or if I may just read it, and you're. Is visible now. Well, let me give you the floor, actually. You can yes.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this event. I became aware of it a few hours earlier, so I am positively surprised that something so interesting for my research agenda, current research agenda, came. And I managed to be here with you. And I have a question with respect to Graham Harman's presentation concerning discussion on current state of OOO. I am myself a lawyer or a sociologist of law. I have mostly a background in law, but I am investigating law from a really broad perspective, social scientific, social theoretic, and philosophical. I am also doing some empirical research, both quantitative and qualitative, and right now I am realizing a project on flat ontologies and law, including OOO. And I have a question, what is your opinion, Graham, on OOO's applications or even mere applicability to social objects of OOO? And I have in mind here objects that can be regarded as institutional, like, for instance, some modern institutionalized religions, or some public institutions in modern democracies. Because if you think from your observations that so far the social application of OOO to such objects was rarely picked up, so what is your opinion on that? Why is that so far, and it is my, of course, opinion, but perhaps you are also agreeing with it, social scientists are so far rarely utilizing OOO. When I read your books, when you were engaging in the social theory, immaterialism, and object-oriented ontology published by Pelican Books, I was wondering about your analysis, because you were treating social objects, in my opinion, mostly through their history, through their past, but not through their current state. So you picked such examples that, for instance, are not picked up by Latourians. So I am wondering, because you said so in your presentation, that you will come back to the social scientific problematics. And can you give us a glimpse on what your direction for this kind of analysis? So thank you very much.
Yes. The reason I chose the Dutch East India Company in the Book of Materialism isn't because it was past, but because it was Leibniz's example, and I was trying to show that Leibniz is wrong about artificial objects and aggregates. So that was the motivation. I think the same thing could be done for the present. As to why OOO is not used that much in the social sciences, well, it is actually used by a lot of people in the social sciences, but it's not a dominant method. And part of that is because we're in a relational moment right now in intellectual history, and social scientists, for obvious reasons, like to focus on relations, and so OOO they will approach only gingerly. But here's what I would say. I mean, I've been influenced by a number of people talking about social sciences, and Manuel Zelanda's book is one of those examples. But what interests me is that the two big philosophical social scientists of the past half century are probably Bruno Latour and Niklas Luhmann. And to my knowledge, no one has ever written a book on both of them. And if somebody did, it could be a great book, because you're either into one or the other, right? Because in some sense, they're opposites. In some sense, Latour makes everything too relational and Luhmann makes everything not relational enough, right? Every system is closed off from its environment. And I think the truth will probably have to draw on both of those insights. And so if I go about talking more concretely about social science, it's probably going to start with the contrast between Latour and Luhmann and what I think each of them is missing that could be supplemented from the other. I do know this, which is that Latour despises Luhmann and Luhmann reportedly despised Latour. I think the young Latour gave a lecture at, there is such a book. Oh, I want to hear about this. I believe the young Latour, thank you. The young Latour gave a talk at Luhmann's university, and I believe Luhmann's first comment was, "You have completely misunderstood every aspect of my thoughts." And anytime I say anything in my work that sounds like Luhmann, Latour says that's a disaster. You're misapplying biological models to the society, this kind of thing. So they're very much at odds, and some. Okay. So that's the direction I would go in. Okay. I don't think it's usually productive to take two thinkers and deliberately try to mix them, because when you do that, you often over-identify their similarities. But it's often helpful to have two thinkers in the background motivating you to find a third way. And that's what I would do.
So thank you very much.
Sure. Okay, thank you, Mr. Dudek, for a question. So as the questions roll in really in the chat, so here's one for everybody, and I'll read it with you. This is the first one I can see, so please feel free to our distinguished speakers to pick up on it. So from Mr. or Mrs. Alfonso Williams, I read it. What elements of OOO do you find most resonant in your everyday life? Not necessarily at the theoretical level, but at the lived, relatable level. Well, as an existential philosopher, I like that question. So whom can I give the floor? It's a personal one, maybe, but still existential.
Well, Yoni just addressed it to some extent, and since I'm going to be answering other questions, I would like to leave this to the rest of you, even though I like Alfonso's questions very much. Okay. I know him very well through social media.
Okay, right. So somebody,
yes, I could speak to the existential part. If that, I mean, that's for me that many, when it comes to the everyday practical applications of OOO, for me that comes very close to what you see in, let's say, early and middle Sartre, right? So in a sense, if you think of the Nausea novel by Sartre, in a sense that could be a OOO book if Sartre wouldn't have been a phenomenologist, especially some of the key passages, but where he sits down on a bench in the park and he looks, I think, at the root system of a tree, and he realizes that root is a thing in itself, and that if you think of it, the root is irreducible to the soil and to what he thinks of it and the rest of the tree, and that kind of produces this bout of nausea that happens throughout the book, and that is the kind of let's say everyday awareness where I think OOO completely overlaps with some of those kinds of themes in existentialism, up to the point where you could even like fantasize about a OOO author who does kind of the quasi-Heideggerian thing where you start to describe the world in terms of moods and existentialen that are more, what would you call it, attuned to realizing practically, to realizing what things really are in kind of a non-intellectualized way. But beyond my real enthusiasm for those overlaps, I have no further theoretical subtleties to offer on that point.
Yeah, could you then say, giving that example, that real objects are everything that potentially survives us?
Sorry, can you do that again?
Well, could you then say, or can you then state that real objects are those objects that potentially survive us?
Potentially or really, I mean, if you follow Tristan Garcia's take on things, then nothing ever really dies, and Napoleon and medieval siegecraft and I don't know, all kinds of dinosaur species that have vanished are actually really here still, just not present to us as intensely as everything else. But I think, yeah, that could definitely be one of those moods, is to realize that the most trivial object on your table that you normally only ever encounter in a use context is not just something that can break, but something that might survive all of us.
Okay, thank you.
I would add something to that. I think that in a way, outliving us is more Measu's theme than mine. When he talks about the ancestral, he's talking about something that comes before or after us in time, whereas I'm more interested in that which is beyond us right now, while we're here. So that would be one difference.
Okay.
I like it. Can I add one thing to that?
Yes, please.
Examples of that, so the things that are unreachable in space, let's say, rather than in time. I think that religious, especially taboo objects, have a very nice examples of that. So in many religions, right, in sanctuaries, you will have specific rooms or specific containers into which nobody gets to go or nobody gets to look, except maybe if you're one specifically sanctioned priest who gets to go behind the thing or in the thing. And I just want to add that for me, like religious art and iconography and ritual has a lot of good examples of these kinds of things that are kept at a distance and literally withdrawn from us.
Okay, thank you. There's a next question in the chat, and I just read it aloud from Giovanni Ciotti. Is it correct to say that in OOO we move from metaphors as rhetorical epistemological means, that is, our ways of representing encounters between objects, to metaphors, symbioses, as social events, that is, dynamics of actual encounters between objects? Anyone?
Yeah. Yes. In a sense, OOO treats causality as a kind of metaphor. Or metaphor is a kind of causality. A metaphor is an actual production of a hybrid object. And so it is an event, and it isn't just something humans do, but it's something that objects do to each other as well. So I'd say that's right. Tim Morton in Realist Magic probably talks about this in the most detail.
Okay, thank you. You want to add? Yes? Just quickly pick up on that, on what Graham just said about. I found a kind of intriguing, where you said, causality is a kind of metaphor, or causals are a kind of metaphor, and vice versa. Metaphors are a kind of causality. Mm-hmm. Is a kind of needed? Is it really needed? Or can we say causality is metaphorical and vice versa?
No, I was hedging too much. I should have just said is.
Okay.
I should have said kind of.
Okay, thank you. I just go on with the questions in the chat because they keep on appearing. So please feel free to any of the speakers to pick up on them. There's a question from Sherang Kilampure. One of the things that this panel reminded me, he says, is the idea of style that Graham notes in his second book. I do not recall if this idea is developed further in any of other works. Do you have any thoughts about style and existence today?
Yeah, in Guerrilla Metaphysics, I talk about an object as a style, but later when I talked about Lingus's book, The Imperative, I was thinking of style more as a level, right? That Lingus talks about how you emerge into a different level and all the objects take shape in that level. Like you go into a room where the lighting is different and the lighting somehow bathes all of the objects and creates a style to the room. This has to do with two senses of mediation that I've written about, but this article hasn't been published yet. Nikki knows this article. I think it's called Two Faces of Mediation, and it's out in Turkish only so far. The English is endlessly delayed. And that's the idea that, first of all, there's medium in the sense of what McLuhan talks about. It's the background that's always there, that you're operating inside of, and as long as it's the active medium, you don't notice it until it reverses or is retrieved differently. And then you've got what's called a mediator, which is kind of the thing that's in your current place that serves as a mediator to go somewhere else, which you also find in McLuhan McLuhan talks about the flip from cliche to archetype, right? So there's an old dead medium that's there in our environment and kind of boring, and then the artist, as he puts it in the broadest sense, was able to flip that into a new medium. That's kind of like the mediator. And another analogy for that would be Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida, his book on photography, where he talks about the difference between studium and punctum. The studium is kind of the general mood of the photograph. and the punctum is the one point that catches his eye, apart from the general medium. So what was the question again that got me on this tangent? Oh, style. Yeah.
Style, yes.
So style, in a way, I talk about how all experience happens on the interior of an object. So when I'm perceiving a tree, this perception actually occurs on the interior of a third new object that is composed of me and the tree. And that third new object that I'm inside of can be described as a style. It creates a new world in which I am contemplating this tree. It creates a kind of tree style to the perception, and that helps guide me into specific facts about the tree. I don't know if any of that coalesced coherently, but that's what style means for me. Anyway.
Okay, thanks. Please let me know if you want to add somebody. If not, I just go on. There's then a question from an archaeologist, if I got that right, Katarina Harabas. A general question, so that could be then for anybody of you, I guess, because being an archaeologist, I'm wondering, is there a space in relational ontology for evaluating the influence of some objects, in her case, the archaeological artifacts, on relations with a human in the past? Well,
archaeology, I don't want to monopolize here. I have an answer to the question, so people can cut me off if I'm going to talking too much. Archaeology is one of those other fields where OOO has had an impact, people both for and against. And I have dialogue with these people sometimes, and I've written a couple of articles on this. Yes, OOO is not anti-relation. It simply tries to treat relation in terms of the internal relations of it. So if I'm relating to something else, it's not so much that I'm relating to this thing outside of me, it's that I and the thing are creating a kind of exclusive space that involves both of us and excludes the other things outside of it. Like a friendship, right? A friendship is a relation, but it's also not a relation in a sense. It's its own object that is intelligible to neither of the friends, right? Friendships can surprise you, they can break, they can become closer or more distant. And so the friendship, or a love relation, or any kind of relation between two things, is a separate object that none of the people involved in it quite understand. And so I would say the same thing with the relation to an archaeological object in the past. What I would say is Arjen hinted at this, one way in which OOO in my version differs from Tristan Garcia is one of these people who thinks there's a universal cosmic memory, everything that's happened is still out there somewhere. And I'm more of a presentist. I'm more of a person who thinks the present is all that's here. We're going to talk about this in April at the Time Conference. The present is all that's here, and so anything that seems to be past that's still here has been translated in order to remain. It's been translated into a different form, because I don't think there's such a thing as a form that can maintain itself perfectly from one place to another. If something outlasts itself, it's a new form. It's a slightly different form. It's been translated. To use a famous philosophical example, Kant says there's nothing in 100 real crowns that isn't there in 100 imaginary crowns. It's difference in position. I say no, there is a difference between 100 real crowns and 100 imaginary crowns. They're actually different forms. They superficially seem like the same form, but since they're made of different components, they have completely different properties, the 100 real crowns and the 100 imaginary crowns. So that's how I would push back on Kant on that famous point. And in terms of archaeology, I think you have to look at how the past is translated into the present terms, which is always going to happen. There's no way to get nakedly at the past can surprise us. The past can surprise us with its difference from us, but it's always going to be a translation to some degree. And so the Greeks for us today are different from the Greeks of Heidegger or the Greeks of Winkelmann or the Greeks of Nietzsche and Wagner. There's always going to be a different Greeks depending on who's looking at them.
Can I?
Yes, Arjen, and then I think Joni too wants to.
No,
yes?
Let's just Joni, you go first.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to add that I think that for Garcia, it's necessary that the past is retained, because Garcia does not think that there's a substantial character to an object, right? Whereas for us in the OOO business, so to speak, it's relatively easy to say, well, what of the past? Well, the past is whatever is retained on the inside of an object, right? So my childhood is not causally affecting me in any way, except for whatever it has managed to, well, let's use terms that the Derridians will love, inscribe in me such that there is still a trace of that in my being. But if you don't have that kind of interior, as in Garcia, then you have to say, if you want for there to be an effect of the past on the present, you have to say that the past is somehow still actual. He has no choice.
Yeah. You know, interestingly, Arjan, I've long imagined debates in my head between you and Tristan. For some reason, I think you two would really click. The energy is similar, in my opinion, with the two of you, and I hope to see a debate between the two of you at some point and see what sparks.
I've had one very short conversation. It was in Amsterdam. You were both wearing the same sweater. You and Garcia were on the podium, and afterwards, I was really enthusiastic, and I went up to Garcia and asked him all kinds of questions, but I jumbled my words, and I think that if I ever see him again, that he will either not remember me or think that I'm a complete idiot, with which he shouldn't have to do anything.
You won't think you're a complete idiot. He's a really nice guy, but I would like to see a discussion between the two of you sometime. It feels like you're coming from a similar existential angle. I don't know how to put it.
Okay, that can be organized whenever you're in Dortmund again, Graham. Then you can make it maybe. Okay, Joni, you wanted to say something?
Maybe one. Yeah, I've lost my idea a little bit, but I wanted to already foreshadow the next question. Not that I want to steal the moderator's thunder.
Oh no, there you go.
Here on what's OOO's view on the notion of the world. Is there the world as the object? I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, and Graham can probably also shed light on this, but like, you know, in relation to what you said about presentism, Graham, like, you know, you define yourself as a presentist. Could we say then that, could we say, and maybe going off on an unwanted tangent here, but could we say that the world arises anew in every moment?
I think what the question may be getting at is something like what Marcus Gabriel talks about in his book, Why the World Does Not Exist.
Yeah,
if I'm correct. And I would agree with Marcus about that. I don't believe there's a whole. We can say the whole, but it doesn't really bring everything into a whole when we say it. It's a kind of abstraction. It would take work to bring the whole universe together, and it's impossible to do that. It would take an infinite amount of energy. And so I would also agree with the idea that the world does not exist. It takes labor to combine things into a larger whole, and there's nothing saying the whole universe somehow exists at that level. I think that's what the question is after.
If I may interject, I think I actually remember precisely how you answered this question in your work, Graham. I believe that the answer to this question specifically is that there is no bottom object, because there is an infinite regress of objects in OOO, but there is also no infinite progress of objects into the world as a whole, because, and this is what I believe you say, because there is nothing forcing objects to enter into relations with one another.
That's right.
Of course, for there to be an object like the world as a whole, that would necessarily entail a relationism, because the system would have to close in on itself.
Right.
Whereas because OOO rejects the idea that the world that objects, are intrinsically defined by their relations, there is nothing forcing the system to close in on itself. Therefore, there's no object, there's no world as a whole.
That's a very Kantian conception of world, right? We're discussing here now. Yeah, it's a very Kantian conception of world.
Nikki, where is that? Do you remember?
I may be. I can't remember the work specifically, but I remember the quote. There is nothing forcing objects to enter into relation with one another. I have it somewhere written, so I can check.
Yep, that definitely is true.
Okay.
Can I add?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Interestingly, is that we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I don't know if that's an idiom in English as well. It's a Dutch one, but okay, so then it doesn't sound ridiculous. That's nice, because the person who asked the question clarified world in a Heideggerian sense of world, poor, animal, and so on. And I think that many in OOO would agree that there is no total thing in the sense that Marcus struggles against. But that doesn't mean that there is also not maybe the anthropological sense of a world, namely we happen to be human beings who are never just engaged with a particular nice delineated set of things in front of us because we happen to be creatures for whatever reason that think in terms of a total out there. We are creatures who use words like world or nature or horizon or the future for better or for worse.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
I guess
what I meant.
sure.
We were dealing with a quite Kantian conception of world, whereas, sorry, Graham, I don't want to interrupt you.
The problem I have with the Heideggerian conception of world is its totality, and the fact that that totality is organized by Dasein. Because you get this sense in Heidegger that world is always a one, and yes, it's potentially many when it breaks, but why would it need to break to be plural, right? Is it really the case that the hammer is perfectly fused into this construction site, and that only when the hammer breaks does it become individualized? That's the way I read Heidegger. Wolfendale claims that's an invalid reading of Heidegger, but I don't think he gets it. Because the hammer already has to be different enough from the rest of the world in order to break. That's how I approach Heidegger. He's not just the philosopher of the equipment, which is a totality. He's also the philosopher of broken equipment, and broken equipment can never break in the first place if it's doesn't have a prior independence of unexpressed properties. So I'm sorry if I misunderstood the question about world the first time.
No, it was yes, Nikki, please.
Oh, sorry. No, just because I wanted to tell everyone that I actually found the quote. It's in Aristotle with a twist. It's in the book Speculative Medievalisms. I can actually read from the quote itself. It says, we find that individual things must be divisible into subcomponents if they are to have distinct individuality at all. And this requires an infinite regress into the depths of things. But here again, the reverse does not hold. There need not be an infinite progress upward into larger and larger entities, and finally into some world as a whole, since there is nothing forcing substances to enter into combination with other substances. This is from page 252 of Aristotle with twist.
I stand by those words.
As we all do. So I'm sorry to having to interrupt here. It's 2 minutes to 10. I guess most of us are getting tired, or almost, especially those who have a whole working day behind their tooth yet, if that's a good expression. So, Joni, I guess it's only fair to give you the last words here, and you can maybe, say something to us all to wish us a good night, or. Well,
yes, definitely. Thank you. Well, actually, thank you is one of the last things I just wanted to say to close off this, what I found a very interesting and thought-provoking session. Event with a lot of great, I think all the talks were great. It's unfortunate, of course, that we have to keep all these intervention so short, but because this was an online event, we couldn't make it a whole day because that's just too long, I think, to sit behind a computer and stay focused and concentrated. So we had to compress a little bit, but I think it worked out fairly reasonably. And in any case, there were questions in the chat. And those that weren't answered were probably noticed by the people addressed. So there might still follow some interchange, and of course you can contact each other afterwards if you'd like to discuss things further. So that leaves me to just with a couple of words of thanks. First of all, of course, to Graham and all the speakers, Nikki, Lisa, Hans, Arjen. Thank you for taking the time and for sharing your thoughts with us. That was absolutely great. Word of thanks also to Laureano Rallon, who isn't here, but who initially helped to put together the symposium and the program. My dearest colleague Carl, of course, who also moderated part of our event. And helped to organize, and of course our center, the Center for Ethics and Humanism. all the technical people at the VUB, because I think this worked fairly well on a technical level. There were some glitches, but they remained feasible. So I'm very happy with that. And of course, that's also to the credit of my colleagues who make sure that we can do this in this way. And then finally, I want to thank you, all the attendees in the audience who showed up and took your time to come and listen to us and to interact. Thank you very much. So thank you all, and I wish you a very pleasant rest of the evening, or the morning, or the afternoon, or the night, or wherever you are. This event was also recorded and will be made available afterwards. So if you want to watch it again or listen again, then that should be possible in a short while. So thanks again, and good night or good day.
Thanks, everybody.